Elizabeth Carter picked up the pen. Her husband shoved across the table, signed her name without a single tear, then slid the wedding ring from her finger and laid it on top of the divorce papers. "You asked for my signature, Nathaniel, not my suffering." The richest man in Virginia had braced himself for her weeping, her begging, her fury. He got none of it. If you love stories where a wronged woman rises with her chin held high, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. The pen scratched twice across the paper, and then it was done. Nathaniel Carter had planned this morning for a week. He had rehearsed the words in the dark, lying awake beside a wife he no longer trusted, telling himself a man had a right to protect what was his. He had imagined every version of how she might break. He had prepared himself for the tears. He had steeled himself against the pleading. He had even, God help him, prepared to be cruel, if cruelty was what it took to make her sign. He had not prepared for this. "Elizabeth." She did not look up. She set the pen down gently, the way a person sets down something they have finished with, and she folded her hands in her lap. "You have your signature," she said. "That was what you wanted. I want you to understand what you just did. I understand it better than you do." He had married her 2 years ago in a church full of people who whispered that a Whitmore girl had done very well for herself, catching the eye of the wealthiest landowner in 3 counties. Elizabeth Whitmore, daughter of a merchant family sliding quietly toward ruin. He had thought back then that she would be grateful. He had thought gratitude was the same thing as devotion. He was 33 years old, and he had learned a great many things about ledgers and land, and men who wanted to cheat him, and almost nothing at all about the woman he had put a ring on. "You'll want to know your terms," Nathaniel said. His voice came out harder than he intended because the softness in it frightened him. "You keep your father's name. You keep whatever you brought with you. I am not a man who leaves a woman with nothing, whatever she has done. Whatever I have done." She repeated it slowly, tasting each word. "Say it plainly, Nathaniel. You are not a coward in your business dealings. Do not become one now. You know what you did. I know what you were told." For a moment neither of them spoke, and in that silence Nathaniel felt the first cold threat of something he could not name. He had come into this room certain. Certainty was the only thing that had let him do it. And now she was sitting there calm as still water, and his certainty was shivering at the edges like a candle in a draught. "There were letters," he said. "Yes. You do not deny them." "I do not deny them. They exist," Elizabeth said. "I deny every word written on them. But you have already chosen which of us to believe, so I will not waste my breath. A woman only begs a man who might still listen." She reached up then and did the thing that would stay with Nathaniel Carter for the rest of his life. She worked the wedding ring off her finger. It came slow because she had worn it 2 years, and her hand had grown around it, and she placed it on top of the signed papers. Not thrown, not slammed. Set down careful and final, like closing the lid of a coffin. "Elizabeth, I am not Elizabeth Carter anymore," she said. "You saw to that. You may call me Miss Whitmore, or you may call me nothing at all." Nathaniel stood so fast, his chair scraped back and nearly toppled. "You will not turn this around. I am not the one who... You are the one who did not ask." Her voice rose for the first time, and it was not a shout. It was worse than a shout. It was steady and clear, and it cut straight through him. "In 2 years, Nathaniel, you never once asked me a single thing that mattered. You asked whether the accounts were settled. You asked whether the horses had been seen to. You asked whether I had received the Aldridge family for dinner. You never asked me what I feared. You never asked me what I hoped. And now at the very end, you did not ask me whether it was true. You told me it was, and you handed me a pen, because I saw the proof." "You saw ink on paper," she said. "You have built your whole fortune knowing that ink on paper can lie. But you believed it because it was easier than believing you had married a woman worth trusting." He had no answer for that. It landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there, a splinter he would not be able to reach. There was a knock at the door, then soft and uncertain, and Thomas the steward put his head in. He was an old man who had served the Carters since Nathaniel was a boy, and he had a way of appearing exactly when the ground was shifting under everyone's feet. "Beg pardon, sir? Mrs. Carter?" He caught himself glanced at the ring on the table, and his face went carefully blank the way a servant's face goes blank when it has understood everything in an instant. "Miss Whitmore, the carriage you asked after. It's ready whenever you should want it." "You ordered a carriage," Nathaniel said. "Last night," Elizabeth answered, rising. "I am not a fool, Nathaniel. I knew what was in that envelope the moment you set it down at supper and did not touch your plate. A man doesn't lose his appetite over crop yields." Thomas hesitated in the doorway. "Miss," he said, and his old voice had gone rough. "The house, that is. Shall I have the kitchen pack you something for the road at least?" "Thank you, Thomas. That would be kind." The old man did not move. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe, and Nathaniel watched uncomprehending as tears stood in the eyes of a man he had known his entire life. "I've served this family 50 years, Thomas said, and it wasn't clear he was speaking to anyone in particular. "I served your father, sir, and his father before him, and in 50 years I never saw this house run so well as it has these 2 years past. Never saw the tenants fed proper, never saw the books so clean." He shook his head slowly. "You'll forgive an old man for speaking out of turn?" "Thomas," Nathaniel said. "That will do." But the words had already been spoken, and they hung in the room, and Elizabeth had gone very still. "You never told him," she said quietly. "Told him what? That the books were clean because I cleaned them. That the tenants were fed because I fought your managers to feed them." She let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, except there was no laughter in it. "You truly don't know. You've lived beside it for 2 years and you don't know. I know the estate has done well. You think it did well on its own." She shook her head. "You think prosperity is a thing that simply happens to rich men. Nathaniel, when I came to this house, you were 3 months from ruin and you had no idea. Your manager Halloran was skimming a fifth off every account. Your grain was rotting in a barn with a hole in the roof because no one had thought to mend it. There were tenant families eating boiled bark and you did not know their names. That is a lie. Ask Thomas." Nathaniel turned to the old man. Thomas would not meet his eyes. "Ask him," Elizabeth said, again softer now. "Ask him who found the discrepancy in the mill accounts. Ask him who sat up 3 nights with a lamp and a stack of ledgers and caught Halloran with his hand in the till. Ask him who wrote to the bank in Richmond and renegotiated the debt your father left you. You want to know what I did in this marriage, Nathaniel? I saved it. I saved everything you own, and you are about to sign it away from the only person who ever protected it." The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere below, a door opened and shut, and Nathaniel Carter felt the floor of his certainty crack straight down the middle. "If that were true," he said slowly, "you would have told me. I did tell you." She was gathering her gloves now, pulling them on finger by finger, and the ordinariness of the gesture made it terrible. "I told you 100 times, at 100 suppers, and you nodded and thought of something else. I stopped telling you when I understood you had never once listened. There is a particular kind of loneliness, Nathaniel, in saving a man's whole world and having him look straight through you as though you were a servant who'd overstepped. That is not— Do you know what you called me the last time I tried to explain the accounts to you?" She turned to face him, and for the first time there was something raw underneath the calm. "You said, 'You needn't trouble your head with figures, Elizabeth. Leave the men's work to men.' And I had just finished saving your fortune from a thief. I stood there in my own drawing room having rescued you from ruin, and you patted my hand and sent me to see about the flowers." Nathaniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He remembered saying it. That was the worst part. He remembered the exact evening. Remembered thinking himself gentle. Remembered feeling like a good and patient husband, indulging a wife's small ambitions. He had believed he was being kind. "I never meant—" "You never mean anything," Elizabeth said without heat. "That has always been your trouble. You are not a wicked man, Nathaniel. If you were wicked, this would be easier. You are simply a man who has never once had to look." And so when a beautiful woman came to you with letters and whispered that your wife had betrayed you, you did not look then either. You believed her because believing her cost you nothing, and believing me would have cost you your pride. The name hung unspoken between them. And as if summoned by it, there came a second knock at the door, brighter, more confident than Thomas's had been, and Caroline Whittaker swept into the room. "Nathaniel, I heard the carriage and I thought—" She stopped. She took in the papers, the ring, Elizabeth standing with her gloves on, and something moved behind her lovely face too quickly to catch, and then it was gone, replaced with concern so smooth it might have been genuine. Oh, I've come at a dreadful moment. Forgive me, I'll go." "No," Elizabeth said. "Stay, I should like a witness." "Elizabeth," Caroline said gently. "You're upset. Of course you're upset. Anyone would be. Why don't you sit?" "Do not," Elizabeth said. "Speak to me as though I am hysterical. It is a very old trick. Caroline and I have watched you use it for 2 years. You lower your voice, and you widen your eyes, and you make the other woman seem mad simply by staying calm. But I am calmer than you are. Look at me. I have not raised my voice once this morning. You are the one whose hands are shaking." Caroline's hands were, in fact, not entirely steady, and she folded them quickly to hide it. "I don't know what you think I've done," she said. "I know exactly what you've done. I simply cannot prove it yet. But I want you to remember when the day comes, and it will come, that I told you so to your face in this room with witnesses." Elizabeth's gaze flicked to Thomas, then back. "You forged those letters. You had access to my correspondence because I trusted you with it. God forgive my stupidity, and you copied my hand and you wrote lies, and you brought them to a jealous man who wanted to believe them. You did it because you have wanted this house since you were a girl, and you could not have it while I stood in it. Nathaniel," Caroline breathed, turning to him, her eyes brimming now. "How can you let her speak to me this way? After everything?" And here was the moment. Nathaniel felt it come. Felt the fork in the road open up beneath him, and he understood with a sick lurch that whatever he said next, he would carry to his grave. He looked at Caroline, weeping prettily. He looked at Elizabeth, dry-eyed and steady, with her ring on the table and her gloves on her hands. "Caroline," he said. "Leave us." Caroline blinked. "What?" "I said leave us. I need to speak with my wife." "She is not your wife," Caroline said, and it came out fast and sharp before she could soften it, and in that half-second, the mask slipped and something ugly showed underneath. She heard it herself. She pressed her lips together. "Nathaniel, forgive me. I only meant the papers, you signed them." "Leave," Nathaniel said. "Us." Caroline left. But at the door she paused, and she looked back at Elizabeth, and for just an instant, the two women regarded one another with perfect understanding and perfect hatred, and then Caroline was gone. The room felt larger without her, and colder. "You believe me," Elizabeth said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Just now, for half a moment, you looked at her and you believed me." "I don't know what I believe." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "You don't. That is the whole tragedy of it, Nathaniel. You never did know. You are a man who has spent his whole life certain of everything and sure of nothing." She picked up her small traveling case from beside the chair she had packed it herself in the night while he slept, and she turned toward the door. "Wait." The word came out of him before he could stop it. She waited. "If—" He hated how his voice caught. He was Nathaniel Carter. He did not beg. He had never in his life had to ask anyone for anything. And here he was, standing in a wreckage he had built with his own hands, and the only word he could find was please, and he could not make himself say it. "If what you say is true, about the accounts, about Halloran, about all of it, then why—" His jaw worked. "Why did you never make me see it? A wife who saved her husband's fortune would not stay silent about it. She would demand her due." Elizabeth turned back, and for the first time all morning she looked tired. Not sad. Tired the way a person is tired who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just now set it down. "Because I did not do it for my due." she said. "I did it because there were children on your land who would have starved, and because there was a house full of people who had served your family faithfully and deserved to be paid, and because—" Her voice wavered just once, just barely. "Because I loved you, you fool, and I thought if I could only hold it all together long enough one day, you would look up from your ledgers and see me. Not the accounts, not the dinners. Me. I thought love was a thing you earned by being useful. It took me 2 years to understand that a man who only values you for your use will never love you at all. He'll only fear the day you stop being useful." She let that sit. "And now that day has come," she said. "I hope the house survives without me. I truly do. There are good people in it who deserve better than either of us." She walked to the door. Her hand was on the latch. "Elizabeth." She did not turn this time. "The ring," Nathaniel said. "You could keep it. It was my mother's." For a long moment she was still. Then very quietly, without looking back, she said, "That is exactly the problem, Nathaniel. In this whole marriage, that ring was the only thing you ever gave me that had belonged to someone you loved, and you only remembered it belonged to your mother the moment I gave it back. Keep it. Give it to Caroline if she'll have it. She's wanted it long enough." And then she was gone. The door did not slam. That was the thing that undid him. He had braced for a slam. A slam he could have answered with anger, and anger he knew how to hold. But she closed the door softly, the way you close a door on a room where someone is sleeping, and the soft click of the latch was the loneliest sound Nathaniel Carter had ever heard. He stood in the empty room for a long time. Thomas was still there. He had forgotten Thomas was there. "Sir," the old man said gently, "shall I— Is it true?" Nathaniel did not turn around. He was looking at the ring on the papers, at his own signature and hers side by side, at the small gold circle that had come off her finger with such difficulty. Halloran. The accounts. What she said. "Is it true, Thomas, and I will know if you lie to me. 50 years I will know." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's true, sir. All of it, and more than she said." Nathaniel closed his eyes. "More. She never told you the half of it, sir, because she never wanted the credit. But there's not a man, woman, or child on this land these 2 years who hasn't had reason to thank her, and most of them don't even know it was her because she asked me to keep it quiet. Said a mistress oughtn't lord it over the house." The old man's voice thickened. "There was the Pruitt baby, sir, last winter, the one that took fever. She sat up 3 nights with that child in the tenant cottage herself in the cold with her own hands. The Pruitts named it after her. Elizabeth Pruitt. You've a child named for your wife on your own land, sir, and you never knew because you were in Richmond that week seeing to a horse." Nathaniel Carter had made his fortune by never showing what he felt. He had negotiated with men who would have skinned him alive if they'd smelled weakness on him, and he had learned to keep his face as smooth and blank as a frozen pond. It was the most valuable thing his father had ever taught him. Never let them see it move you. His face moved now. There was no one to see it but an old man who had wiped his nose as a boy, and it moved anyway, and he was glad his back was turned. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he said, and it came out cracked and low. "Beg pardon, sir, but we did." Thomas said it without cruelty, which made it worse. "I told you myself more than once that the mistress had a rare head for figures. I told you the tenants had never been so well looked after. I believe I told you that first winter that you'd married the best steward this estate ever had, and I meant it as the highest praise I know how to give. And you said—" Thomas paused. "You said it was a wife's place to see to such things, sir. And you changed the subject to the hunt." Nathaniel remembered that too. He was beginning to understand that his whole marriage was a house full of small moments he had walked straight past, and that Elizabeth had watched him walk past every one of them and had said nothing, and had simply gone on saving him. "Send someone after the carriage," he said suddenly. Tell her." "Tell her what, sir?" And there, Nathaniel stopped because he did not know. What could he possibly send after her? An apology. He had accused her of betrayal in front of the household not 1 hour ago. He had put papers in front of her that named her a faithless wife. He had believed Caroline's lies because they had flattered his fear, and he had never once in 2 years asked his wife a single question that mattered. What was a message going to fix? What words existed that could be shouted at the back of a departing carriage that would not simply be one more thing he said to her without listening? Nothing, he said finally. Let her go. Sir, let her go, Thomas. She has more than earned the right to leave without me chasing her down to make myself feel better. If I go after her now, it's for me, not for her. And I've done enough things in this house for me. He drew a breath that shook. Let her have this. Let her leave clean. Thomas studied him a long moment, and something in the old man's face shifted surprise, perhaps, that his master had said a true thing. That, Thomas said quietly, may be the wisest thing I've heard you say in 20 years, sir. Pity it took losing her to say it. The old man withdrew, and Nathaniel Carter was alone. He did not stay alone for long. Grief, he was learning, does not respect a rich man's solitude any more than a poor one's. He heard within the half hour the sounds of a house rearranging itself around an absence. Footsteps quicker than usual, voices dropped to whispers, a door somewhere shutting too hard, and then guiltily too soft. He heard a maid crying in the corridor and being hushed. He heard the kitchen fall silent when Cook was told, and he had known Cook 30 years and had never once heard that woman fall silent. And he heard near noon the confident tread he had come to know so well, and Caroline Whittaker came back into the room without knocking. There, she said, and her voice was all warmth now, all sympathy, and she came toward him with her hands out. There, it's done. It's over. You did the right thing, Nathaniel, the hard thing, and now you can begin to heal. I know it hurts. Betrayal always hurts most from the ones we loved. But you're free of her now, and one day you'll— Sit down, Caroline. She faltered. Of course. She sat. She arranged her skirts. She looked up at him with those wide, lovely, brimming eyes, and Nathaniel Carter looked back at her, and saw for the first time a woman studying his face the way he studied a ledger, hunting for the number that would tell her what she'd won. How did you come to have the letters? He asked. Caroline blinked. What? The letters that you brought me. Elizabeth's correspondence with whoever he was meant to be. How did they come to be in your possession? I told you, a friend passed them to me. I couldn't in conscience keep such a thing from you, however much it pained me. Which friend? Nathaniel. You've never given me a name. He kept his voice mild. He had spent 20 years keeping his voice mild, while the ground shifted, and he was very good at it, and Caroline did not yet understand that the ground had shifted. In all these months, in all the times you brought me some new proof of my wife's faithlessness, you have never once given me the name of the friend who supplied them. I never asked because I did not want to look. Elizabeth was right about that. I did not want to look. He leaned forward slightly. But I am looking now, Caroline. Give me the name. For the space of 3 heartbeats, Caroline Whittaker's face was perfectly, brilliantly blank. Then the tears came right on time. I can't believe you, she whispered. After everything, you're doing it to me now. The same thing you did to her. The moment she's out the door, you turn on me. Answer the question. How dare you? The name Caroline. And she stood up fast, her chair scraping just as his had that morning, and the mask came off all the way this time, and there was nothing pretty underneath it at all. You want a name? She hissed. Fine, fine. There was no friend, Nathaniel. There was no friend because there was no lover. Because your saintly little wife never so much as looked at another man. She was too busy nursing your tenants' brats and balancing your books and mooning after you like a whipped dog while you ignored her. Is that what you wanted to hear? Is it? The room went very cold and very still. Caroline heard herself. Her hand flew to her mouth, but it was too late. It had been too late from the moment she'd raised her voice, and she knew it, and Nathaniel saw her know it. You forged them, he said. It was almost a whisper. You forged them yourself. Nathaniel. Get out of my house. You don't understand. I did it for us. I did it because she never deserved you, because you were wasted on a merchant's daughter, because I have loved you since we were children, and you married her. You married her for her pretty manners and her clever head, and you never even get out. You never even saw that I was standing right there. Thomas. The old steward was through the door before the echo died, and behind him, two of the stablemen, as if the whole household had been holding its breath just outside waiting. Miss Whittaker is leaving, Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone to iron. She will not be received in this house again. Not at the door, not in the yard. If she is seen on Carterland after today, she is to be turned back by whatever means necessary. Is that understood? Perfectly, sir, Thomas said, and there was grim satisfaction in it. Nathaniel. Caroline was not weeping now. Her face had gone white and hard. Nathaniel, you'll regret this. You've thrown away the one woman who truly wanted you for a ghost. She's gone. She's signed. She's never coming back, and you know it, and you'll spend the rest of your life in this great empty house, knowing you had two women who loved you, and you drove them both out in a single morning. You'll be sorry. I'm already sorry, Nathaniel said. But not for the reason you think. Take her out, Thomas. They took her out. She did not go quietly, but she went, and the front door of Carter Manor shut behind Caroline Whittaker for the last time, and the sound of it was a good deal louder than the sound Elizabeth had made. And then at last, Nathaniel Carter was alone with the truth. He sat down at the table where the papers still lay. He picked up the ring. It was warm still from having been in his hand, or perhaps that was only what he told himself. It was a small thing, gold worn thin on the inside where 2 years of a good woman's work had rubbed against it. His mother had worn it 40 years. Elizabeth had worn it too. And he had been married to her for every one of those 700-odd days, and he could not sitting there remember the sound of her laugh. He tried. He genuinely tried sitting alone in his silent house to summon up the memory of his wife laughing. And he could not do it because he had never once made her laugh, because he had never once tried, because he had thought a wife was a thing you acquired and maintained like an estate, like a fine horse, like a name. He remembered instead the way she'd looked up at him that morning, dry-eyed, steady, setting down the pen the way you set down a thing you're finished with. You asked for my signature, Nathaniel, not my suffering. He had wanted her to suffer. That was the thing he could hardly bear to look at now that he was looking at everything. Some small, cruel part of him had wanted her to weep and beg because a weeping, begging wife would have proved she still wanted him, and a wife who still wanted him would have proved he still had power over something. He had put those papers down, and he had wanted God forgive him to watch her break, and she had not broken. She had simply seen him all the way down, all the way to the frightened, grasping, unloved boy underneath the richest man in Virginia, and she had taken off her ring, and she had told him the plain truth, and she had walked out into the summer morning with her chin up and her case in her hand, and she had left him with everything he owned, and nothing at all that mattered. Nathaniel Carter, who did not weep, sat alone in his beautiful house, and turned his mother's ring over and over in his fingers, and outside the windows, the Virginia summer went on green and golden and indifferent, and somewhere on the road to town, a carriage carried away the only person who had ever in his whole guarded life actually stood beside him, and he had signed her away with his own hand, and set his name beside hers on a paper, and he had never once asked her whether it was true. He closed his fist around the ring until the thin gold band bit into his palm. "Elizabeth," he said to the empty room. The empty room did not answer. It never would again. Not the way it had before, and Nathaniel Carter, rich, ruined, and finally far too late awake, sat in the wreckage of the finest thing he had ever owned, and understood. At last exactly what a man forfeits when he mistakes a woman's silence for her surrender. The ring left a red mark in his palm. He looked at it for a long time. Then he rose, crossed to the great front door his wife had walked through an hour before, and opened it to the summer light, as though the road might somehow still hold her. It did not. There was only dust and the far green line of the fields she had saved, and the long, bright, empty day. The day after Elizabeth left Carter Manor woke up wrong. It was Thomas who felt it first. 50 years in service had made him a man who measured a house not by its walls, but by its rhythms. The time the kitchen fire was lit, the sound of boots on floorboards, the particular quality of silence that meant everything was running as it should. He had known walking these halls since before Nathaniel Carter was born what a healthy house sounded like. And standing at the top of the main staircase that first morning after he knew, with the certainty of a man who has outlived everything he was trained to serve, that Carter Manor had already begun to die. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the cook asking with genuine bewilderment who she was meant to consult about the week's provisions, and Thomas having no answer. It was the young housemaid Lucy who arrived at the study door to ask about the household ledger, and had to be told that the ledger was wherever Mrs. Carter had kept it, and no one actually knew where that was. It was the head groom appearing at noon to report that 3 of the tenant farmers were at the gate, with a question about the irrigation ditch in the east field, a question they had apparently been rooting through Elizabeth for the better part of a year. And no one had thought to mention this to Nathaniel, because it had never seemed worth mentioning. The mistress handled it. The mistress always handled it. The mistress had a head for such things. Nathaniel spent that first day in his study with the door closed. He told himself he was working. He was not working. He was sitting at his desk, with his mother's ring in his fist, and the divorce papers in front of him still unsigned on his side, which he couldn't quite account for, and he was listening to his house stumble through the first morning without the woman who had held it together, and he was beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he had done. By noon, he had received 5 separate knocks on the study door, each one bringing a question that Elizabeth would have resolved before breakfast without troubling anyone. By 3 in the afternoon, Thomas appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man delivering very bad news very gently. "Sir," he said, "I have been asked by the kitchen to relay that cook cannot find the accounts for the market in Richmond. Apparently, Mrs. Carter maintained a separate record of prices. What we paid, what we should pay, what vendors we trust, and which ones have cheated us. And without it, cook does not know who to send to for the autumn preserves, as the usual man may have given us bad measure last year, and she cannot recall whether it was confirmed or only suspected." Nathaniel stared at him. "There is also," Thomas continued unsparing, "the matter of the Pruitt family in the East Cottage. Young Samuel Pruitt came up to the house to ask after his lease renewal. Apparently Mrs. Carter had been negotiating it on his behalf for the past 3 months, and he was to receive an answer by the end of this week. He didn't know things had—" Thomas paused delicately. "Changed. He asked to speak with her directly. I had to tell him she was gone." "What did he say?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He took off his hat," the old man said at last, "and he stood there with it in both hands, and then he said, 'She never told us she was the one doing it. She let us think it was you, sir.' And then he walked back down the road without another word." That one landed. Nathaniel set the ring down on the desk. "She let you think it was me," he repeated slowly. "In everything, sir. She signed off on nothing in her own name. Every improvement came through your name. Every negotiation, every arrangement, every mercy she extended to the families on this land, all of it was presented as coming from you. She made you look like the most generous and capable landowner in 3 counties, sir, and you never knew, because she never told you, because she didn't do it to be thanked." Thomas folded his hands. "She did it because it was right, and because she loved you, God help the woman." Nathaniel stood up so fast, his chair rolled back and struck the wall. "Don't," he said, and his voice was rough in a way he hadn't allowed in years. "Don't say that again. Someone has to say it, sir. You drove out every person in this house who would have said it to your face. There's only me left, and I'm too old to be afraid of you." Thomas straightened. "I have been in service to this family for 50 years. I will serve it faithfully until I cannot stand. But I will not pretend, and I will not be silent, and if you want to send me away too, then you'll manage this house alone, and good luck to you." Nathaniel looked at the old man. Something in his chest that had been rigid and cold since yesterday morning began very slowly to crack. "I don't want to send you away," he said quietly. "Then let me help you find out the full of it," Thomas said. "What she did here. All of it. because I think, sir, that you have not yet understood how much there is to find." They spent the rest of that afternoon in the estate office, Thomas and Nathaniel side by side over 2 years of meticulous records, and with every page, Nathaniel turned. Something in him went colder and heavier and harder to carry. Elizabeth had not simply balanced the books. She had rebuilt them from rubble. Halloran, the manager Nathaniel had trusted for 6 years, had been systematically stripping the estate, falsifying invoices, pocketing the difference, routing funds to an account in Fredericksburg under a cousin's name. The scheme was elegant, and it was old, and it had been running since Nathaniel's father's final year, when the old man's eyesight had begun to fail, and he'd relied on Halloran more and more. Elizabeth had found it in her first winter at Carter Manor, working through a stack of old ledgers by lamplight when she couldn't sleep because she had grown up watching her father's merchant accounts, and she knew in the marrow of her what a number was supposed to look like. She had caught it alone. She had gathered the proof alone. And then she had gone to Thomas and laid it all out and asked him to help her handle it quietly, because she knew if she went to Nathaniel, he would demand to know how she'd come to be investigating his accounts in the first place, and he would read her competence as a challenge rather than a gift. That part made Nathaniel set the ledger down and press the heels of both hands against his eyes. "She was afraid of how I would react," he said, "to being helped." Thomas said nothing, because the answer was written in every page in front of them. "She was right," Nathaniel said. "God help me. She was right to be afraid of it. I would have told her she was overstepping. I would have said she had no business in the accounts, and I would have—" He stopped. He breathed. "What did she do with Halloran?" "She had me relay a message to him, sir, without your name attached to it. Told him she knew what he'd taken, told him the exact figures, told him she'd see him at the county circuit court if he wasn't gone from Carterland by nightfall. He was gone by noon." Thomas paused. "She never asked for a cent of it back. Said a legal case would have dragged on 2 years and cost you half again what you'd lost, and the humiliation of it wasn't worth the money. She just wanted him gone." "She protected my pride," Nathaniel said flatly. "Even then. Always, sir. From beginning to end." Nathaniel stood and walked to the window, and stood there looking out at the fields that had remained prosperous and well-managed, and quietly, invisibly kept by a woman he had spent 2 years looking straight through. He thought about the morning he had put the papers down. He thought about her voice, steady without drama, without the performance of pain he had expected. He had walked into that room certain she was guilty, and she had known he was certain, and she had known the letters existed, and she had known there was not a single thing she could say that would move him, because the one damning fact of their marriage was that he had never once listened. So she had not wasted her breath. She had simply signed and told him the truth and taken off her ring and gone. And every gracious, quiet, capable, generous thing she had ever done for this house and this land and this man had walked out the door with her in a small traveling case on a Tuesday morning in July. Now came the part Nathaniel was least prepared for, because grief for a man like him does not come all at once. It comes in pieces, and each piece comes wearing a different face. The first piece came wearing her handwriting. 3 days after she left, Thomas brought him a small stack of papers he had found in the estate office, notes in Elizabeth's hand, addressed to no one in particular, recording decisions she had made and reasoning she had applied, so that whoever came after her would understand the logic of the place. She had written them in the weeks before the divorce, Thomas believed, which meant she had known. She had seen what was coming, she had understood the shape of it, and in those final weeks she had been quietly documenting everything she had built, so that the house would survive her departure. She had protected Carter Manor even while preparing to be expelled from it. Nathaniel read those pages standing at his desk, not sitting, and he turned them over one by one in silence. Her handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to make her words fit the available space. There were notes on the tenants, which families were struggling, which children were ill, what small reliefs had been quietly extended, and on what terms. There were notes on the vendors in Richmond who could be trusted, who had tried to short the wait, who had a difficult year and might need patience. There were notes on the mill, on the barn repairs, on the irrigation matter in the east field, on the proper schedule for the grain stores through to winter. At the bottom of the last page, in slightly different ink as though written on a different day, there were 3 lines that were not addressed to anyone and not about the estate at all. If he looks for it, he'll find the Pruitt child's christening record in the church at Milford. I asked Reverend Cook to enter it as Elizabeth Whitmore Pruitt. The Whitmore was for my mother, not for me. She never knew it either. Let it stay quiet. She deserves a name that belongs to no unhappy marriage. Nathaniel put the page down very carefully on top of all the others. He stood there for a moment in complete silence. Then he walked out of the study and past Thomas in the hall and out the front door of Carter Manor. And he stood in the summer heat with his fists at his sides and his jaw clenched, and he looked out at the fields and the road, and he breathed through it, the whole impossible weight of it, because there was no place else for it to go. A child on his land bore Elizabeth's mother's name. Elizabeth had arranged it without anyone knowing, without telling even the family it was for, and she had asked for it to be kept quiet because she did not want it attached to something unhappy. That was the woman he had handed divorce papers to. That was the woman he had called faithless. That was the woman he had believed Caroline Whitaker's forged letters over because it had been easier than believing in goodness. He stayed outside until he could trust his face again. Then he went back in, and he sent for the Pruitt family, and he sat with Samuel Pruitt at the kitchen table. Not the formal table, the kitchen table, because Elizabeth would not have used the formal table. And he was beginning to understand that he had been doing everything wrong, and he had to start somewhere. And he told Samuel that his lease was renewed for 10 years, unconditional, at the same terms Elizabeth had promised him. Samuel Pruitt, who was 26 and sunburned, and had the calloused hands of a man who worked hard every day of his life, looked at Nathaniel for a long moment, and then said in a voice that was very careful and very quiet, "She negotiated 3 years for us, sir. You said 10. 10, Nathaniel said. Samuel Pruitt looked at him another moment. Then he looked at the table. "She was going to tell us it was your generosity," he said. "Even the 3 years. She was going to say you'd extended it." "She would have," Nathaniel agreed. "She was a good woman," Samuel said. "She was the best kind of woman, the kind that does good without wanting credit." He looked up, and there was no particular accusation in his face, just a simple steadiness that was somehow worse. "I hope she's well, sir, wherever she's gone." "I intend to find out," Nathaniel said, and the words came out before he had decided to say them, and when he heard them in the air, he understood they were true. But he was not ready yet, and somewhere under the impulse he already knew it. Because a man who goes after a woman 3 days after he signed away her marriage is not a man who has learned anything. He is simply a man who is lonely and frightened and wants his problem back where he can see it. Elizabeth had told him exactly what she thought of a man who moved for himself rather than for her. She had seen it in him with absolute clarity. And if he was going to be worth going after her, he needed to first understand the full scope of what she'd been living. That understanding arrived not long after in the shape of a letter. It came from Abigail Monroe, Elizabeth's aunt, her mother's older sister, who had raised Elizabeth after her parents' deaths, and whom Nathaniel had met precisely twice, both times briefly, both times having assessed her as a sharp-tongued old woman of no particular consequence. He had apparently been wrong about her, too. "Mr. Carter." The letter began without preamble. "I am writing to you because my niece is too gracious to do it herself, and because I have at least 30 years of opinions I have been sitting on, and I find I cannot continue to sit on them, now that she has arrived on my doorstep thinner than when she left, and with that particular look in her eyes that I remember from when her father lost his business, and she was 18, and the world fell out from under her, and she simply held her chin up and kept walking. You would not know that look. You would not know it because you never once looked at her long enough to see it. I will not waste your time with accusations. I will waste it with facts. In the 2 years of your marriage, my niece wrote to me every fortnight. She never complained about you, not once. She described you as a man of principle. She described your land as beautiful. She described your tenants as people she had come to care for. She described the work of running your estate as satisfying in a way she hoped you might one day share with her. She was in every letter the most careful and faithful of wives. Not because she was frightened of you, though perhaps she should have been, but because she had decided to love you and Elizabeth when she decides a thing is the most constant woman I have ever known. She also in those same letters described being lonely. She did not use the word. She was too proud. But I know my niece's handwriting, and I know the sentences she uses when she means something she won't say outright, and for 2 years she wrote to me in the handwriting of a woman living on hope that was running thin. She never blamed you. That is the part that should haunt you. After everything, the divorce, the humiliation, the accusation, the letters. She arrived at my door, and she said, "He is not a cruel man, Aunt Abigail. He simply never learned to look." That was all she said about you. She sat down, and she drank a cup of tea, and she asked me how the garden was getting on. I am writing because I think you are a man who has perhaps just looked for the first time and found the view considerably worse than you expected. I am not writing to give you hope. I am writing to make sure you understand the full of what that woman carried in your house, because if you ever intend to face her again, you should face her knowing. She did not leave a comfortable life. She left a life she had built with her own hands out of the materials you gave her, which were indifference and suspicion, and a ring that was already someone else's. She built something worth living in out of those materials. She built it for you, and then she walked away from it with her head up and left it all in your hands knowing you did not know how to hold it. She deserves better than a man who comes to her only when his house is falling down. You know where she is. I imagine you will come when you have made your decision. I imagine, God help me, that she may not send you away. But I want you to understand the terms. She will not return to what was. She will not be grateful. She will not be managed. If you come to her, you come as the man she described in those letters, the man she believed you could become, or you do not come at all. Abigail Monroe. P.S. The garden is getting on fine. She has already improved it considerably. She has that effect on things. Nathaniel read the letter twice, standing in the hall where Thomas had handed it to him. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his breast pocket against his ribs, where he could feel the corner of it pressing into his chest with every breath. He did not go to her that week, or the next. He was not ready, and he knew it, and for the first time in his life, knowing he was not ready felt like wisdom rather than weakness. What he did instead was begin. He started with the tenants. He went out on foot the way Elizabeth had gone when she visited the cottages without a horse to signal his importance, and without an appointment to signal his authority. He went as a man who owed something, which was what he was. He went to the Pruitts first, because Samuel's face had stayed with him, and he sat in their kitchen and he met the baby. The baby was 8 months old and looked. Nathaniel thought privately, like all babies, looked red-faced and furiously alive, and was called Elizabeth Whitmore Pruitt, and when he said the name aloud, the Pruitt wife looked at him with a directness that women generally didn't use on men of his position and said, "She was the first person who came when the fever came. She sat up all night. My husband offered to pay her back any way we could, and she said." The woman smiled, but her eyes were not smiling. She said we could name the baby whatever we liked, but if we were looking for a name, she'd always thought Elizabeth was a good, strong name for a girl because girls needed strong names. Nathaniel held the baby because the Pruitt wife put her in his arms before he could decline, and he stood there in their small, warm kitchen, holding a child named for the woman he had thrown away. And he thought he had never in his life felt so comprehensively, so utterly, so deservedly small. He went to 6 cottages that week. Every single one. He heard a version of the same story 6 times. Elizabeth had come quietly. Elizabeth had listened. Elizabeth had never promised what she couldn't give, but what she could give she gave without making anyone feel the debt. At the last cottage, an old widow named Mrs. Hale, who had lived on Carterland for 40 years, gripped his hand in her gnarled ones and said, "You find that woman, and you beg Mr. Carter. You get down on your knees in the mud if that's what it takes. A woman like that comes along once in a life, and most men don't even notice when she's standing right in front of them, and I'm telling you this because I'm 74 years old, and I know the particular look of a man who has just figured out what he had." "Yes, ma'am," Nathaniel said because there was nothing else to say. "Don't yes, ma'am me," Mrs. Hale said. "Go." He was not ready to go, but he carried that old woman's voice with him back to Carter Manor, and it sat with all the other voices, Thomas's, Samuel Pruitt's, Abigail Monroe's letter sharp against his ribs. And what they collectively made was a picture of himself that he found almost impossible to look at and impossible to look away from. He was not a cruel man. Elizabeth had said that to her aunt, and Thomas had confirmed it, and he believed it, and it was the most damning thing he had ever heard said about himself, because not cruel was the smallest possible grace. Cruelty was a choice. Not seeing was a habit, and habits were invisible and endless, and had been running through his whole life, like water through stone, carving out a shape in him without his ever noticing. His father had been the same. Nathaniel understood that now in a way he hadn't before. Sitting alone in the house his father had nearly bankrupted. His father had not been cruel either. His father had been a man who looked at his wife and saw a wife at his land, and saw a ledger at his son, and saw an heir. He had provided. He had been present in the physical sense of the word, and he had loved no one in the end with anything but the theoretical love of a man who knows he is supposed to love the things he possesses. Nathaniel Carter had married a woman convinced he was not his father. He sat with that for a long time. Meanwhile, Caroline Whittaker was not quiet. He had expected her to leave. She had always been a practical woman. It was one of the things that had made him trust her. The way practicality had always read to him as honesty, and a practical woman, having been expelled from a house with witnesses, and no room for recovery, ought to cut her losses and remove herself from the county. Caroline did not cut her losses. Caroline denied the quiet victory she had arranged for herself, went to work on the one weapon she had left, which was the county itself. It started with the Aldrich family, who received Caroline at their table the very week after the divorce and listened to her account of it over supper. The Aldriches were not malicious people, but they were social people, and social people had a particular relationship with a story. They could not hold it still. By the time the Aldrich account reached the Pattersons 2 days later, Elizabeth had become the wife who had walked out in a rage, throwing the ring at her husband's head. By the time it reached the Merriweather ladies at the Thursday sewing circle, there was a rumor of a lover Elizabeth had been corresponding with in Baltimore, which was Caroline's original lie risen again, more resilient for having been set aside. Nathaniel heard about it from Thomas, who heard from the housemaid Lucy, who had a sister who attended the sewing circle and came home stunned and sickened by what she'd witnessed. "They're saying she left a good man for another," Lucy reported, standing in the hallway with her hands folded and her face carefully neutral. "They're saying the letters were true. They're saying—" She stopped. "What else are they saying, Lucy?" "They're saying she was never much to speak of anyway, sir. Not real quality. And that a merchant's daughter had no business in this house to begin with, and if she'd known her place, she might have kept it." The rage that went through Nathaniel Carter then was the cleanest thing he had felt in weeks. It was simple. It was clear. It had no complexity to it, no self-examination, required no difficult mirror held up to his own face. It was the pure, hot, uncomplicated fury of a man who understood at last exactly who the enemy was, and found he had apparently been holding the door open for her for the better part of 2 years. "Saddle Ajax," he said to Thomas. "Sir. Now, Thomas, I am going to pay a call on the Aldriches." He rode into town in the full heat of the afternoon, and he went to the Aldrich house, and he was received in the front parlor with the slightly nervous hospitality of people who understand that a man arriving unannounced on a hot July day is probably not there for the pleasantries. He sat down across from Henry Aldrich, who had known him 20 years, and he told him plainly what had happened, all of it. From the letters to Caroline's own admission in the study, from the forgery, to the expulsion, from the truth of what Elizabeth had done for Carter Manor, to the truth of what Nathaniel had done to Elizabeth. He held nothing back, because a man who was done not looking needed to start somewhere, and he decided he would start by looking at himself in public, which was the hardest place there was. Henry Aldrich listened in the particular still way of a man revising a settled opinion in real time. "My God," he said when Nathaniel finished. Yes, Nathaniel agreed. Carolyn Whitaker told us. I know what she told you. She told you a version that had no one in it who had done anything wrong except my wife. She is very good at that. She's been practicing for 2 years, and I was too blind to see it. He leaned forward. Henry, I need the county to hear the truth. Not for my sake. I don't deserve anything from this county. But Elizabeth Whitmore came here as my wife, and worked on this land for 2 years, and loved the people on it, and was thrown out by me on the basis of forged evidence. The county drove her mother's family into ruin, with its small cruelties and its whispers. I will not sit by while it does the same to Elizabeth. Not while I have a voice left and a horse to ride. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said very steadily, What do you need from me? A platform, Nathaniel said. The county gathering next week. I want to stand up in front of all of them, and I want to say in public what I have just said to you in private. I want Caroline Whitaker's name cleared of any remaining doubt as the author of this scheme, and I want my wife's name. He stopped, corrected himself, the word my wife, landing somewhere tender. I want Elizabeth's name cleared of every whisper that woman put on it. Henry Aldridge nodded slowly. You'll have it, he said. But Nathaniel. He met his eyes. Will she come back? After all this, does she? I don't know, Nathaniel said honestly, and that honesty cost him something saying it out loud. I don't know if she'll have me. I don't know if she should, but she deserves to walk back into this county with her head up regardless of what she decides to do with her life. She deserves that much. It's the least I can give her. He rode home in the early evening, and the fields came gold around him, and Carter Manor rose up at the end of the road, looking beautiful and empty, the way a house looks when it has the bones of a home, but someone has taken all the warmth out of it and gone. Nathaniel rode past the gate and through the yard and handed Ajax off to the stable hand, and he went inside, and he sat down at his desk, and he took Abigail Monroe's letter out of his breast pocket, and he set it flat on the table in front of him. She deserves better than a man who comes to her only when his house is falling down. His house was falling down. He knew it and could not pretend otherwise. But he also understood in a way he could not fully explain that Abigail Monroe had not written that sentence to tell him to stay away. She had written it to tell him the price. She was telling him what kind of man he had to become before he had any right to stand in front of her niece and speak. He was not that man yet. But he thought, sitting in the quiet of his study with the summer evening coming on and the long Virginia fields going dark through the window, that he might be able to become him. Not for Elizabeth. Or not only for Elizabeth, but because the man he had been, the man who had looked straight through a good woman for 2 years and called it a marriage, that man was someone he had no wish to continue being. He was tired of him. He was tired of the ledgers and the cold face, and the certainty that had kept him safe from feeling anything for 33 years. He was tired of the house his pride had made, and he was ready to live in something real. He had made a disaster, and a disaster took time to repair properly, and he owed it to her to take the time. He would go to the county gathering. He would stand up. He would say it all out loud. And then he would do what a man who had spent his whole life acquiring things had never once in his life done. He would wait. He would wait, and he would work, and he would let her decide. He would not manage the outcome. He would not negotiate her back. He would become worthy, or he would fail. And for the first time in his life, he understood that failing was something that could happen to him, and that he deserved it, and that doing the work anyway, not for the outcome, but because it was right, was the only honest choice left to him. Outside, the last light faded over Carterland. A lamp came on in the kitchen, and somewhere a door opened, and a woman's voice called something to someone in the yard, and the ordinary sound of it, a woman's voice in the evening, a house settling into its nighttime self, went through Nathaniel Carter like a knife, because it was not her voice, and this house was full of women's voices that were not hers, and would be for as long as he had failed her, and he had to learn to hold that loss without running from it. He opened his desk drawer. He took out a sheet of paper. He dipped the pen. Dear Miss Whitmore, he wrote, and stopped. The name looked wrong and right at the same time, wrong because she was his wife, right because he was the one who had named her otherwise. He sat with the blank page for a long time. Then he put the pen down. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had too much, and none of it was worth sending yet. And he owed her better than words written in the first raw heat of his understanding. He owed her words that had been lived, not just felt. He folded the blank page and put it back in the drawer. One day he would fill it. When he had earned the right. The county gathering was held on a Saturday the way it always was, in the yard behind the Milford courthouse, where the oaks were old enough to have shaded 3 generations of arguments and marriages and public shames. Nathaniel had attended every one since he was 16 years old, and his father had brought him to watch how a man conducted himself in front of his neighbors. He had always stood near the back, slightly apart, the way wealthy men stood when they wanted to signal that they were present as a courtesy and not as a supplicant. He had stood that way for 17 years. He did not stand that way today. He arrived early. He tied Ajax at the post himself without waiting for anyone to take the reins. He walked into the middle of the yard, and he stood there, and people noticed, because Nathaniel Carter standing in the middle of anything was unusual enough to remark upon, and the noticing spread outward through the gathering crowd in that particular ripple that moves through a community when something is about to happen that will be talked about for years. Henry Aldridge found him within minutes. "You're sure?" Henry said quiet beside him. "I've been sure for 2 weeks," Nathaniel said. "I was just late arriving at it." Caroline was there. He had expected that too. She stood on the far side of the yard with Margaret Merriweather and 2 of the Patton daughters, and she saw him the moment he walked in, and something shifted in her posture, a subtle pulling together, a gathering of herself that he recognized now as calculation. She was already working out what he was here to do and how to counter it. That was who she was. He had mistaken it for strength for so long that he had trouble even now separating the two. She was not strong. She was hungry. There was a difference, and he should have seen it long ago. The gathering came to order in its informal way, the way Virginia County gatherings always did, with no official call, but a collective settling that said the time for milling about was done. Nathaniel waited until the Hendersons had finished their dispute about the creek boundary and the Methodists had announced their harvest supper, and then he stepped forward. The yard went quiet so fast it was almost physical. "I have something to say to this county," Nathaniel began, "and I will say it plainly because it is a plain matter, and because I have spent too long in my life avoiding plain things, and I am done with that." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. 2 weeks ago, I divorced my wife on the basis of forged letters that I believed to be true. The letters were forged. My wife is innocent of every charge attached to her name. And I stand here today to say so in front of every person who heard otherwise, because the person who spread the lie had help from my own credulity, and I owe this county and Elizabeth Whitmore a public accounting. The silence lasted 1 beat too, and then it broke into the murmur of 40 people revising 40 separate understandings simultaneously. Caroline did not move. She was very good at not moving. The letters, Nathaniel continued, were produced by Caroline Whittaker, who admitted it to me directly in my own study and in the presence of witnesses. She had access to my wife's personal correspondence. She used it to copy Elizabeth's handwriting. She did this over a period of months, and she brought the results to me, knowing I was a man who feared betrayal above all things, and would believe what confirmed his fear without looking further. He paused. She was right about that. I did not look. That is on me, and I will carry it. But the lie was hers, and this county deserves to know it. Now people were turning toward Caroline. Now the ripple was moving the other direction. Caroline moved. She had been still as long as she could hold it, and now she stepped forward, and her chin was up, and her voice was perfectly controlled, and she said, "Nathaniel, I think you are grieving, and I think grief has led you to a terrible conclusion. I understand that you want to believe your wife was innocent. It's natural, but the letters were in your handwriting under Elizabeth's," Nathaniel said flatly. "A part you missed on the 4th page where you were copying a character you do not form the same way she does. I have had a man in Richmond examine the documents. He has 20 years' experience with questioned documents in the circuit courts. He will testify to his findings before any magistrate this county cares to appoint." The color left Caroline's face. It was the first time in all the years he had known her that Nathaniel had seen Caroline Whitaker genuinely startled. Every other emotion she had ever shown him, he understood now, had been managed. This one was real. She had not known about the examiner. She had not known he had moved that far. "You went to Richmond," she said, and it came out slightly hollow. "3 days after I sent you out of my house," he said. "I want to be clear, Caroline. I am not accusing you here today to hurt you. I am doing it because Elizabeth's name has been in this county's mouth for 2 weeks, and every day it stays dirty is a day that belongs to a lie you built, and I will not allow that. Not one more day." Margaret Merriweather, who had hosted the sewing circle, where the worst of the rumors had spread, had gone the color of old milk. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at her hands. The 2 Patton daughters had stepped very quietly away from Caroline's side, the way people step away from something that has just been identified as dangerous. Caroline was alone in the middle of the yard. She gathered herself. You had to give her that. She gathered herself with a speed and a grace that spoke to how many times in her life she had been knocked back and had risen from it, and she said very quietly and very dangerously, "You will regret this, Nathaniel." "I already regret a great many things," he said. "Add it to the list." She walked out of the yard without looking back, and the crowd parted for her, and Nathaniel watched her go, and felt nothing but tired. Henry Aldridge was at his elbow immediately. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen a man do in this yard, or the most catastrophic." "Probably both," Nathaniel said. "What happens now?" "Now I go home," Nathaniel said, "and I write the letter I've been putting off for 2 weeks, and I wait to see if she'll read it." The letter he finally wrote that night was not long. He had composed it in his head 100 times during the ride home, and every version he tried was too elaborate, too crafted, too much the work of a man who was accustomed to negotiating his way to the outcome he wanted. Elizabeth would see through every word of it. She had always been able to see through him. He understood now that was why he had never looked back, because looking at a woman who could see you clearly was terrifying to a man who had spent his life controlling what others knew of him. So he wrote the truth plain and short, the way she would have written it. "Elizabeth, I stood up in the Milford courthouse yard today and told the county everything. The forgery, Caroline's admission, all of it. Your name is clear. I did not do this to earn anything from you. I did it because it was right and because it was owed. I have also spent the past 2 weeks speaking with the people on this land about what you did here, though. I understand now I should have been doing that for 2 years instead of 2 weeks. I am not writing to ask you to come home. I do not know if home is a word that belongs between us anymore, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am writing because I want you to know that I looked finally. I know what I saw, and I am sorry. Not the kind of sorry that asks for something back. The kind that understands it cannot. Nathaniel Carter. He sent it with the Morning Post. Then he sat down and he waited, and waiting was the hardest thing he had ever done, because waiting without managing was a skill he did not have, and was being forced to learn at 33 with no one to teach him and no precedent to follow. The response came 11 days later. He was in the East Field with Samuel Pruitt, learning at Samuel's patient insistence the correct way to assess whether an irrigation ditch was diverting properly, which was something Elizabeth had apparently known, and which Nathaniel had not, when Thomas came across the field with the letter held carefully above the grass as though it might dissolve. Nathaniel looked at the handwriting on the outside of it and felt his chest do something complicated. "Thank you, Thomas," he said, and his voice was steady, and he tucked the letter into his coat pocket without opening it. He had Samuel finish explaining the ditch. He asked 3 questions, all of them genuine, all of them things he actually needed to know. Then he walked back to the house and went into his study and sat down and opened the letter and read it. It was shorter than his. "Nathaniel, I heard about the gathering from Aunt Abigail, who heard from Mrs. Henderson, who attended and apparently wept, which I choose to believe. Thank you for what you did. I know it was not easy. I know how much the county's opinion matters to you, and I know that standing up and saying those things cost you something real. That matters to me. I want you to know that. I am well. I am working in Aunt Abigail's garden and reading and resting in a way I did not realize I needed. I am not ready. I want to be honest with you about that. I am not ready to see you, and I cannot tell you when I will be, and I will not make you a promise about it that I am not certain I can keep. I learned in our marriage that made promises tend to become silences. I would rather tell you the truth. E.W. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it and set it beside his mother's ring, which sat on the corner of his desk, where he had put it the morning she left and had not moved since. She was not ready. She had said so, and she had said it honestly, which meant she had not closed the door, which meant the door was still there. That was the thing he held on to, not with hope exactly, but with the steadiness of a man who has decided to do what is right, regardless of what he receives for it. He wrote back the following day. Elizabeth, take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere. I have recently learned that I have approximately 2 years of this land to actually learn, and it turns out I know considerably less about running an estate than I believed. Samuel Pruitt is currently educating me about irrigation, which I am told you understood entirely. I am told a great many things you understood entirely. I intend to understand them too. N.C. 3 weeks passed. Then another letter. Nathaniel, Samuel Pruitt wrote to me separately to tell me you have been in the fields every morning for 2 weeks, which he described as unprecedented in living memory. He also said you apologized to him directly for not knowing his family's name for the first 2 years of your tenancy. He said, and I quote, "He looked me in the eye when he said it. Miss Elizabeth and I believe he meant it." From Samuel, that is the equivalent of a written character reference. E.W. He smiled at that letter in a way he hadn't smiled at anything in months alone in his study, with the Virginia evening coming on, and the house quiet around him. And it startled him. The smile, it felt like something coming back to life that had been dormant long enough that he had stopped expecting it. He wrote back, I have also been told that I hold the plow wrong. I am attempting to remedy this. She wrote, you have never held a plow in your life. He wrote, correct. It shows. She wrote 2 days later, and this letter was slightly longer and the handwriting was less careful, as though she had written it quickly, without letting herself think too much about it. I am glad you are learning the land. It is worth knowing. The people on it are worth knowing. They always were. Nathaniel, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable. Why did you believe Caroline? Not. I understand about the letters. I understand. They were convincing. I mean underneath that. You are not a foolish man. You are not a man who is easily misled. So why, when she brought you those letters, did some part of you want them to be true? He sat with that question for 2 full days before he answered it. He had known on some level that it was coming. It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that the letters and the forgery and the public apology and the irrigation lessons were all circling around without quite touching. He could answer it glibly. He could answer it with the story of his father and the financial betrayal and the way distrust had become a kind of armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten he had it on. All of that was true, and none of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was this: he had believed Caroline because Elizabeth had been too good, and goodness at that scale had frightened him. And a frightened man reaches for the explanation that makes the frightening thing smaller. A wife who saved your fortune without asking for credit, who loved tenant children in the middle of the night, who quietly became the best part of everything you owned while you weren't watching. That was a woman who had a claim on him that went deeper than a ring, and a man who had spent his whole life making sure no one had a claim on him deeper than what he chose to give, could not hold that without flinching. He had believed Caroline, because believing Caroline meant Elizabeth was ordinary, and ordinary was manageable, and real love, the kind Elizabeth had been offering him for 2 years, quiet and practical and without condition, was not manageable at all. He wrote all of that down, every word of it. It was the most honest thing he had ever put on paper, and it cost him more than the public declaration had, because the public declaration had been done in anger at the right target, and this was done in full sobriety, looking directly at himself. He sent it, and then he sat in his study and wondered what a man did with himself after he had told the most unflattering possible truth about his own heart to the only person whose opinion of him had ever actually mattered. What he did, as it turned out, was go back to work. Because the work was there, and the land needed it, and the people on it deserved a man who showed up even when he was not at his best, which was most days lately. But something had shifted in the estate since the county gathering, and Nathaniel was slow to understand what it was until Thomas named it for him late one afternoon, leaning in the doorway of the study where Nathaniel was going over the autumn accounts. "The people are watching you differently, sir," Thomas said. "How do you mean?" "I mean they watched you before the way people watch a man who owns their home. Respectful, careful. The way you watch something that can hurt you if you move wrong." Thomas tilted his head. "Now they watch you the way they watched Mrs. Carter." Nathaniel looked up from the ledger. "Like a person," Thomas said simply. "They're watching you like a person." Nathaniel didn't answer that, but he held it. The next letter from Elizabeth arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks after he'd sent his confession about why he'd believed the forgeries, and it sat on his desk all morning while he was out with the Pruitt men discussing the barn that needed reinforcing before winter. And when he came in at midday, Thomas handed it to him with the particular expression he reserved for things he considered significant. Nathaniel opened it at his desk. "Nathaniel, I read your letter 4 times. I want to say something about it that I need you to hear correctly, so I am going to be very careful with the words. What you wrote was true. I knew it was true before you said it, and part of me had always known it, because I was not blind any more than you were. I simply chose to hope instead of conclude. We were both frightened, I think. You were frightened that I was too much. I was frightened that I was not enough. And we went through 2 years of a marriage without ever once being honest with each other about either fear, because neither of us knew how to start, and the longer it went on, the larger the silence became, and the more impossible it was to break. I am not saying this to excuse what happened. What happened was real, and it hurt, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am saying it because I have been sitting here in Aunt Abigail's garden for 2 months, thinking I was only examining your failures, and I looked up one afternoon and realized I was also sitting in the middle of my own. I never told you what I needed. I never asked for what I hoped for. I waited, and I hoped, and I loved you from a distance that I made comfortable by calling it patience, and it was patience, but it was also fear. I am telling you this not because it changes what you owe me. It doesn't. But because I will not build something honest on a foundation where you are the only one who has looked. He read it standing up, both hands flat on the desk, leaning over the page, and when he finished, he stayed in that position for a long time, without moving. He was thinking about the word honest, the way she used it, not as a judgment, but as a direction, the way you use a compass bearing. She was pointing somewhere. She was pointing toward something she thought they could build if they were both willing to tell the truth. She was not there yet. She had been very clear about that. But she was pointing. He wrote back the same afternoon, and the letter was short because the most important things usually were. I hear you. All of it. The silence was both of ours, and I did not know it until you named it. I think I am beginning to understand that a marriage is not a thing you own. It is a thing you make. And if you are the only one making it, it is not a marriage. It is a performance. I do not want to perform anymore. I am not sure I know yet how to do anything else. But I am learning, slowly, with considerable help from people who are considerably more patient than I deserve. Then, because she had mentioned the garden, and because he thought it might make her smile, he added at the bottom, "How are the cabbages?" She wrote back in 4 days, which was faster than any previous letter, and the handwriting at the top was careful, and the handwriting at the bottom was not, and he read it as the difference between how she had started and how she had finished, which told him something about the writing of it. The cabbages are excellent. Aunt Abigail says it is my doing, but I suspect it is mostly the soil. I am going to tell you something, and I want you not to read more into it than I mean. Which is a thing I am saying, because I know you and I know how you build a case from a small piece of evidence. It is one of the things that made you a successful landowner, and one of the things that made you a difficult husband. Aunt Abigail has been invited to the Henderson supper next Friday. I will be accompanying her. Mrs. Henderson wrote to me directly, and her letter was kind, genuinely kind, the way a woman writes when she is trying to make amends and not just manage a situation. I believe her. I have decided to go. Milford is a small county, and I will not spend my life avoiding it. I want you to know I am going not because I am expecting anything from it, and not as an announcement of anything, but because it seemed like a thing you should hear from me rather than from Mrs. Henderson's supper table. He sat very still for a full minute. She was coming back to Milford. Not to him. Not yet, or perhaps not ever. That was not what she had said. But she was coming back to the county with her head up, and she had told him first so he would not be caught off guard, which was more consideration than he had shown her in 2 years of marriage. He sent one line in response. "Thank you for telling me. I will make sure I am not in your way." She sent back the next morning, apparently by the same courier he'd used going out, which meant she had replied before the man had even started home. "You are not in my way, Nathaniel. You were never in my way. You were in your own." He looked at that line for a long time. Then he did something he had not done once in the 2 months since Elizabeth had walked out of his front door. He got up from his desk, and he walked out of the study, and he went down the hall and through the kitchen, where Cook looked up, startled, and out the back door, and he stood in the yard in the late afternoon heat, and he breathed the air, and he listened to the land, the birds in the far tree line, the sound of Samuel Pruitt's boys laughing somewhere in the direction of the creek, the distant clop of a horse coming up the east road, and he let himself very carefully feel something that was not grief, and was not guilt, and was not the relentless hammer of his own reckoning. He let himself feel just for a moment the smallest and most fragile version of something that might, if he was very careful, and very honest, and very patient, eventually grow into hope. He did not go to the Henderson supper. He had said he would stay out of her way, and he meant it. And besides, it was not his moment, it was hers. Elizabeth Whitmore, walking back into the county that had whispered about her, was not an event that needed his presence. It needed her own. But Thomas heard from Cook, who heard from the Henderson housekeeper the following Monday morning, and Thomas relayed it to Nathaniel with the careful precision of a man who understood the importance of every word. "She walked in," Thomas said, and the room went quiet. Not the unkind kind of quiet. The kind where people are recalibrating, I believe, is the word. Mrs. Henderson met her at the door and took her hands and said within hearing of the room that she was sorry and that she was glad Miss Whitmore had come and that she hoped the county could do better by her than it had. And then Thomas paused, and the pause had something in it that Nathaniel could not read. And then apparently Miss Whitmore said, "I'm not a woman who holds a county responsible for one person's choices, Mrs. Henderson. Grudges are heavy to carry, and I've recently put down a considerable weight. I'd rather travel light." And then she went in and ate supper and talked to everyone who spoke to her, and made Mrs. Patton cry, though Mrs. Patton cries at most things. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "She said that," he said, "about the weight." "Word for word, sir, or as near as a housekeeper's memory allows." He went back to his desk, and he sat down, and he thought about Elizabeth Whitmore at a supper table in Milford with her chin up, and her hands steady, and no ring on her finger, telling a room full of people who had wronged her that grudges were heavy and she was traveling light. He thought about what it cost a person to say that and mean it. He thought about the kind of character it required, built over years of quiet work and small dignities, and 1,000 moments of choosing grace when resentment would have been entirely justified. He picked up his pen. Then, before he could write a word, there was a knock at his study door. Brisk, businesslike, the knock of someone who had not come to socialize. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and it was not Thomas, and it was not any member of his household. It was James Whitmore, Elizabeth's younger brother, 22 years old, who had taken over the remnants of their father's merchant business, and whom Nathaniel had met precisely once at the wedding, and had since barely thought of. James Whitmore stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was doing its level best to be controlled and was not quite succeeding. "Mr. Carter," he said. "James." Nathaniel stood. "Sit down." "I'll stand, thank you." James came into the room far enough to close the door behind him, but no further. "I'll say what I've come to say, and then you can decide what to do with it. I'm not here to make trouble. My sister would be furious with me for coming at all, so if you could see your way clear to not telling her for a day or two, I'd be grateful." "Sit down, James," Nathaniel said more quietly. James sat. He gripped his hat in both hands and he looked at Nathaniel with his sister's eyes, the same particular steadiness, the same habit of looking directly at the thing. Most people looked around, and he said, "I need to tell you something about the letters. Something I found out last week that I don't think you know. Something that—" He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. "Something that makes it worse." Nathaniel felt the floor shift slightly under him, the way it had in his study the morning Elizabeth walked out, the feeling of certainty giving way beneath him. "Tell me," he said. "The man in the letters," James said. "The man she was supposedly writing to in Baltimore. The lover. Did you ever find out who he was meant to be?" "The letters didn't name him clearly." "No," James said. "They wouldn't, because there was no one. But I did some digging. I know people in Baltimore, the merchant trade. I know who comes and goes, and the name Caroline was circling around the initials. She dropped into those letters. The references." He stopped again, jaw tight. They matched a real man. Mr. Carter. A real person. A man my sister had actually corresponded with once about the legitimate purchase of household goods from a Philadelphia supplier. One letter. Business. Dated a year and a half ago. He looked up. Caroline Whitaker had access to my sister's correspondence because she had been helping organize the household files. She found that one letter, and she built an entire fiction around a real name, a real person, a real piece of paper my sister had a real reason to have. She did not simply forge letters. She used the truth as the scaffolding for the lie, so that if anyone investigated, they would find the one real piece and assume the rest was real too. The room went very still. "She knew," Nathaniel said slowly. "She knew that if I investigated, I'd find that one real letter, and it would confirm everything she'd made up around it." "Yes," James said. "She built the lie to survive scrutiny. She built it specifically knowing how you think that you're methodical, that you verify things that you wouldn't accept it on faith alone. She built it so that the harder you looked, the more convinced you'd become." Nathaniel stood up. He turned away. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, and he breathed through it. Not grief. This time, something colder and cleaner, the particular cold of a man who has understood the full dimensions of how thoroughly he was played, and by someone he trusted, and cannot now call her anything but what she was. 2 years, he said. "She planned it for at least that long," James said. "Maybe longer. She's been waiting for an opportunity since before your wedding." Nathaniel turned back. James was watching him with his sister's eyes, and the expression in them was complicated anger, yes, for his sister, but also something that was almost pity, and Nathaniel found he could receive that. He was past the point where pity from a 22-year-old threatened his pride. "Thank you for coming," Nathaniel said. "You were right that your sister would be furious. You were right to come anyway." "She's my sister," James said simply. "I know." He met the young man's eyes. "For what it's worth, I know it isn't worth what it should be. She is also the bravest and the best person I have ever had the privilege of not deserving. I'm attempting to become worthy of it. I don't know if I'll manage it." James looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on his head precisely the way young men do when they're trying to look older than they are. And he said, "I'll leave that for her to decide, Mr. Carter. She always did have better judgment than the rest of us." He moved to the door. Then he stopped, hand on the frame, and without turning around said, "The forgery examiner in Richmond. You said he'd testify before a magistrate." "I meant it." Then you should know, James said quietly, that there's a magistrate in Fredericksburg who has been looking for a reason to open an inquiry into a matter involving a bank account in that city and an old embezzlement scheme that may have fingers in several other counties. What Caroline did to my sister would not be the only thing on the indictment. It would simply be the most recent. Now he did turn. I thought you'd want to know that the walls she built were thinner than she believed. Nathaniel held the young man's gaze. Give me the magistrate's name, he said. James gave it to him. Then he left, and the study was quiet, and Nathaniel sat down at his desk, and he sat very still for a while with the weight of everything. The 2 years of careful deceit, the built-in safety net Caroline had sewn into her lies, the patience and the precision of what she had done, and he let himself feel the full of it without flinching. And then he picked up his pen and he wrote to the magistrate in Fredericksburg, and the letter he wrote was precise and thorough and attached every piece of documented evidence he had gathered, and it was the letter of a man who had finally fully stopped looking away. He sealed it. He handed it to Thomas. Then he took out a fresh sheet of paper and he wrote one more letter, not to Elizabeth, not yet, not today, but to Abigail Monroe. Miss Monroe, I am writing to inform you that the matter of the forged correspondence is now in the hands of a magistrate in Fredericksburg, and I expect it will not end quietly for the person responsible. I am also writing because your letter to me, which I have read more times than I will admit, contains a standard I have been attempting to meet. I do not know if I am meeting it. I suspect you will tell me honestly if I ask, which is why I am asking. Yours faithfully, Nathaniel Carter. P.S. James came to see me. He is a good young man. You can tell him I said so. He folded the letter and sealed it, and then he sat in the study that had been Elizabeth's favorite room in the house. He had only recently learned that from Thomas, who had learned it from Lucy. And he looked at the ring on the corner of his desk, and he thought about a woman in a garden in Milford who was traveling light, and he thought that the least he could do after everything was make sure she never had to carry anything of Caroline Whittaker's making again. He stood up. He went to the east field to check the irrigation ditch because Samuel Pruitt had asked him to look at it by Thursday, and Thursday was tomorrow, and a man who was trying to become worthy of something started with the small things in front of him. The ditch was doing well. He noted it in the field book Elizabeth had kept, which Thomas had found tucked in a drawer of the estate office and given to him without comment, and his handwriting looked strange next to hers on the page. Unfamiliar and searching, like a man finding his footing on new ground. He was finding his footing. Slowly. Imperfectly. On ground that Elizabeth had already mapped for him. He closed the field book and walked back through the evening that was laying itself down, golden and warm, over Carter Land, and somewhere out ahead of him, 11 miles toward Milford, a woman was putting down her aunt's garden tools and washing her hands, and thinking whatever she was thinking. And he did not know what it was, and he had learned finally that not knowing was not the same as losing it, was simply the cost of letting someone be free. He paid it. He walked home. Abigail Monroe's reply arrived on a Thursday, which was 4 days after Nathaniel had sent his letter, which meant she had not rushed it and had not delayed it, which told him something about the kind of woman she was. She wrote the way Elizabeth wrote, directly without ornamentation, every word doing the work it was supposed to do. Mr. Carter, I have been watching you from a distance for 3 months now, which is the particular privilege of an aunt in a small county. What I have observed is a man doing the work without advertising it, which is the first sign I look for in a man who claims to have changed. Anyone can make a declaration. Making one and then going quietly back to the fields the next morning is considerably rarer. You are not there yet. I want to be honest with you about that. But you are further along than I expected, and I expected very little, so take that for what it is worth. As for Elizabeth, she is not ready. She is also, I believe, no longer as unready as she was a month ago. I am not giving you hope. I am giving you information. There is a difference, and I trust you to respect it. A.M. He read it twice, then put it in the drawer with the other letters. Not hope, information. He could work with that. What came next, however, was not from Abigail Monroe, and it was not gentle, and it arrived not by letter, but in the person of a county sheriff's deputy who knocked on Carter Manor's door on a Friday morning and asked to speak with Nathaniel about a matter of legal record. The magistrate in Fredericksburg had moved faster than Nathaniel had anticipated. He had expected inquiry deliberation, the slow grind of a legal process that would take months to produce anything visible. What he had not expected was that the magistrate, a man named Aldous Briggs, who had apparently been waiting for precisely this kind of documented evidence for the better part of a year, had issued a summons for Carolyn Whitaker within 72 hours of receiving Nathaniel's letter. The deputy's name was Crawford, and he was a young man who had the slightly uncomfortable manner of someone who had been sent on an errand that was above his usual work. He stood in the front hall of Carter Manor, turning his hat in his hands, and told Nathaniel that Miss Whitaker had received her summons, that she had responded by attempting to leave Milford by the northern road at 5 in the morning, and that she had been intercepted at the county line by 2 of the sheriff's men, and was currently being held pending an appearance before Magistrate Briggs the following Tuesday. Nathaniel stood very still while the deputy spoke. "She tried to run," he said. "Yes, sir," which the magistrate says is about as good as a confession in his experience, though he didn't use those words officially. "What are the charges?" "Fraud and forgery, sir, as pertaining to the documents you submitted." There are also 2 other matters being examined: the Fredericksburg bank account, which is what Mr. Briggs had been looking into before your letter, and a separate matter involving a land transaction in Spotsylvania County from 3 years back that appears to have involved a set of signatures that weren't entirely genuine. Crawford shifted his weight. "The magistrate asks if you'll testify at the Tuesday hearing." "I'll be there," Nathaniel said. Crawford nodded, put his hat back on, and then paused at the door. "Sir, for what it's worth, the deputy who brought in Miss Whitaker this morning. He said she didn't say much when they stopped her, just sat in the carriage very still and very quiet." He hesitated. "He said she looked like a woman who had known it was coming and was surprised it took this long." Nathaniel thought about that after Crawford left. He thought about it while he stood in the hall where Elizabeth had stood with her gloves on, and her traveling case in her hand, and her ring already off her finger. And he thought about the patience of it. Caroline's patience, 2 years of careful architecture, and the fact that somewhere underneath the calculation there must have been a version of genuine feeling, however warped, however bent into the shape of acquisition and obsession. He did not excuse it. But he thought about it because he was trying these days to see things all the way through, even the things that were easier to simply despise. Thomas appeared from the direction of the kitchen. "I heard." "The whole county will hear by noon," Nathaniel said. "Yes, sir." Thomas allowed himself a small, satisfied expression that he almost immediately suppressed. "Shall I have the good suit pressed for Tuesday?" "Press it," Nathaniel said. "And Thomas?" He stopped. "Send a message to James Whitmore. Tell him what's happened. He should hear it from us before he hears it from the road." Thomas nodded and went. Nathaniel stood alone in the hall a moment longer. Then he went to his desk and he wrote a letter to Elizabeth. He had been careful with the letters, all of them picking each word the way you pick your footing on uncertain ground. This one he wrote fast because it needed to be fact and not feeling. Elizabeth. Caroline Whitaker has been summoned before Magistrate Briggs in Fredericksburg. She attempted to leave the county last night and was stopped at the line. The hearing is Tuesday. I am testifying. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. You don't need to do anything with this information. I am not asking you to come or to be present or to do anything at all, except know that it is happening and that your name will be formally cleared of everything attached to it before a magistrate's record. It will be in the permanent court record. No one in this county or any other will be able to say it wasn't settled. N.C. He sent it that morning. Her reply came Sunday evening, which was the fastest she had ever written back, and the letter was short, and the handwriting was quick. I know. Mrs. Henderson told Aunt Abigail this morning, and Aunt Abigail told me over breakfast, and then sat there watching my face in a way that only she can do. Nathaniel. I need to ask you something. Are you testifying for me, or are you testifying because it's the right thing to do? I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because the answer matters to me. E.W. He answered within the hour. Both. But if I am being completely honest, which I am trying to be at all times with you, especially the right thing, And the thing that is for you are the same thing in this case, and they have been for a while now, and I am not sure I would know how to separate them if I tried. N.C. She did not write back before Tuesday. He had not expected her to. The Tuesday hearing was not a trial. Magistrate Briggs ran a tight proceeding in a small room at the Fredericksburg courthouse with a recorder and 2 witnesses and the relevant parties. Nathaniel arrived early and was already seated when Caroline was brought in, and he made himself look at her because looking away was a habit he was done with. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not physically, she was the same woman, composed and straight-backed in a dark dress. Her hair correct, her bearing correct, nothing visibly out of order. But something had gone out of her in the 72 hours since the deputy had stopped her carriage, and what remained was a woman without her armor, which was not the same as a woman without her pride. The pride was still there. It was the only thing she had left that was entirely her own. She looked at him once when she came in. He held her gaze and did not flinch from it. She looked away first. Magistrate Briggs was a compact man of about 60, with the kind of face that had been looking at documents for so long it had begun to resemble one precise, unsentimental giving nothing away. He opened the hearing without preamble and ran it the way a man runs a thing he has done many times and intends to do correctly. Nathaniel testified for 40 minutes. He was methodical. He presented the letters, the examiner's report, the timeline of how Caroline had come to have access to Elizabeth's correspondence, the record of the morning in the study when Caroline had admitted the forgery in front of him and Thomas. He testified about the real letter in Baltimore, James Whitmore's discovery, and the way the lie had been built around a genuine document to survive scrutiny. He was careful. He was thorough. He did not editorialize. He simply laid it out piece by piece, the way you lay out a structure, so that anyone looking at it can see how it was built. When he was done, Magistrate Briggs asked him one question. "Mr. Carter, you present yourself today as the primary injured party in this matter, the man who was deceived and acted on that deception. But I want to be clear for the record. Who suffered most from this scheme?" Nathaniel looked at him. "My wife," he said, "Elizabeth Whitmore. She was accused in front of the household and the county of conduct she did not engage in. She was divorced on false evidence. She lost her home and her standing and 2 years of her life. I was deceived. She was destroyed. The distinction matters." Briggs looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something down. "Yes," he said. "It does." Caroline's attorney argued for another hour competently and without any apparent hope, and then Caroline herself was given the opportunity to speak, and she did not take it, which was the first genuine surprise of the morning. She sat through all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her face perfectly still, and when the hearing was concluded and the charges formally entered for trial, she rose and walked out with the 2 county men flanking her, and at the door she paused, and she turned back once, and she looked at Nathaniel, and he expected fury. That was what the Caroline he knew would have given him a final flash of it, something sharp to carry with him. But what he got instead was something close to exhausted, and something that might have been underneath everything grief. She had loved him, he supposed, in the way people love things they want to possess. That was not love, not the kind worth the name. But it was something, and it had run this whole catastrophe, and he could hate what she had done without pretending there was nothing human in her. He did not say anything. She looked away, and the door closed behind her. The ride back from Fredericksburg was long, and Nathaniel made most of it in silence with Thomas, who had accompanied him, and who had his own thoughts about the day and kept them to himself until they were nearly home, at which point the old man said, "She didn't fight it." "No," Nathaniel said. "Interesting." "She knew it was documented," Nathaniel said. "She's practical. She cut her losses." Thomas was quiet a moment. "Or," he said carefully, "she came in this morning and saw you testify about Miss Elizabeth. The way you testified, all of it, not softened, not managed all the damage said out loud, and she understood perhaps for the first time that you were not ever going to be what she wanted. And that understanding cost her something she didn't expect to pay today." Nathaniel looked at the road ahead. "You're very philosophical for a Tuesday." "I've been practicing." Thomas said, with the serenity of a man who knows he has earned the right to be smug. The news reached Milford before they did, which was no surprise. A county that had passed Caroline Whittaker's rumors from table to table for 3 months was not going to sit on her court summons and flight and Tuesday hearing for long. Nathaniel arrived home to find 3 calling cards on the hall table, Mrs. Henderson and both Patton daughters, all 3 apparently having come around in the couple of hours he'd been away to express their sympathies and their support, which in this case he suspected translated to their relief at not having been wrong-footed more than they already were. He was not interested in the calling cards. He went to his desk and he wrote to Elizabeth again, and this time the letter was 2 pages, because the day had loosened something in him and he had things to say that he'd been holding for 3 months, and the time for holding them was done. Elizabeth. The hearing was this morning, and it went as I expected, and your name is formally and permanently on record as having been cleared of every charge that was laid against it. That is the practical matter. The other matter is this: Magistrate Briggs asked me who suffered most from what was done, and I said your name, and I said what you lost, and I heard myself say it out loud in a court of record. And I want to tell you what that was like, because I think you deserve to know. It was the most honest thing I have said in public in my life. Not brave honest. There's a difference. I have said brave things before, things that cost me something, but gained me more. This cost me nothing, and gained me nothing, and was just simply true. And saying true things without a motive behind them is something I am very new at. You have been practicing it your whole life. I watched you do it the morning you left, and I didn't know what I was watching, and I know now, and I want you to understand that it is the hardest thing I have ever seen a person do, and also the most beautiful. I am not saying this to move you. I am saying it because it is true, and because you spent 2 years in a house where true things went unsaid, and I am not going to let that continue to be my habit with you, even from 11 miles away. Even if this is all we ever have, letters across 11 miles, I will not waste them on managed words. You told me you were afraid of not being enough. I want to tell you for the record, and in my own handwriting, that you were always more than enough. The failure of this marriage was a failure of my vision, not your substance. You were there. You were entirely there. I simply never looked. That is the truest and the worst thing I know about myself, and I am telling you because you asked me once to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable, and I am trying to honor that request. Nathaniel. He sealed it and sent it that evening. Then he went to dinner, which cook had laid in the dining room as always, and he sat at the long table alone, as he had done every evening for 3 months, and he ate his meal, and looked at the empty chairs, and did not pretend it was fine. It was not fine. It was a large room with a great deal of good furniture, and no one in it who mattered, and he had done this to himself, and he was living in the doing of it, and that was correct and fair, and he was not going to wince away from it. The following morning brought something he had not expected: a visitor. Not a calling card, not a letter. A visitor standing in his front hall at 9 in the morning with a traveling bag, and the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision and intends to see it through. Abigail Monroe was 60 years old, and looked it in the way that meant she had not wasted time worrying about looking otherwise. She was tall for a woman, with silver hair pulled back severely, and eyes that were Elizabeth's eyes but older and considerably more armed. She stood in Carter Manor's front hall and looked around her with the frank assessment of someone pricing a horse, and then she looked at Nathaniel and she said, "You look worse than I expected. That's a good sign." "Miss Monroe," Nathaniel said. "Mrs.," she said. "I was married. He died. I kept the name because I had earned it. Do you have coffee?" He had coffee brought to the sitting room, and they sat across from each other, and Abigail Monroe drank her coffee and looked at him over the rim of the cup, and said nothing for long enough that he understood the silence was a test of some kind, and kept still through it. "She read your letter," Abigail said finally. "The long one. The one from last night. That was fast," Nathaniel said. "I sent a man with it this morning before I left," she said. "I wanted her to have it before she heard I'd come, so she couldn't accuse me of making decisions for her, which she will do anyway, but I wanted the letter to get there first." She set down the cup. I'm going to tell you something, and you are going to sit there and hear it without speaking until I'm done. Do you understand?" "Yes." "She cried," Abigail said, "when she read it. Not the weeping kind. The kind a woman does when something she has been bracing against for a very long time turns out to not be where she expected the blow to land. She sat at the kitchen table with your letter, and she was quiet for a long while. And then she put it down, and she walked out into the garden, and she stood there, and I watched her from the window, and she had her hand over her mouth the way she used to do when she was a child, and was trying very hard not to show that something had broken through her." Abigail paused. "And then she came inside, and she washed her face, and she said, 'He's telling the truth now. I can hear it in the way he writes.' And I said, 'What are you going to do about it?' And she said, 'I don't know yet.' And I said, 'You'll figure it out.' And then she said nothing for a long time, and then she said, 'I miss Carter Manor, Aunt Abigail. I miss the people on it. I miss the East Field in the evening. Is that strange?' And I said it was not strange at all. And then I said I was coming to see you, and she said she supposed she couldn't stop me, and I said no. She couldn't, and here I am." Nathaniel had kept still through all of it the way she'd asked. Now he said, "Why did you come?" "Because I wanted to see the house," Abigail said simply. "Because my niece has been describing it to me for 2 years in her letters, and it has been in my mind, and I wanted to see whether the real thing matched what she built of it with her words." She looked around the sitting room. "It does. She has a good eye." "She has a good everything," Nathaniel said, and it came out plain and quiet, and Abigail looked at him sharply. "Yes," she said after a moment. "She does." She set her cup down. "Mr. Carter, I am not here to broker anything. I am not here to tell you what to say or what to do. I am here because I am a 72-year-old woman who has watched a great many men fail, a great many women, and I wanted to look the man who failed my niece in the eye and see whether there was something in there worth salvaging. And I have been in this house 40 minutes, she said, and Thomas has already told me 3 things about you that you didn't tell him to say because you didn't know he was saying them, and all 3 of them were things a man does when he is not performing. So," she picked up her cup again, "you may be worth something. I reserve judgment. That's the most encouraging thing anyone has said to me in 3 months," Nathaniel said, and something in his face shifted, and Abigail Monroe looked at him. And for the first time since she'd walked in, she smiled, and it was Elizabeth's smile, the same shape, the same directness. And it went through him, the way cold water goes through a man who didn't know he was thirsty. Abigail stayed 2 days. She toured the estate, which she did on foot, at a pace that tired the housemaid who accompanied her and did not tire her at all. She spoke with Thomas at length in private, and Nathaniel did not ask what was said. She went to the East Cottage and the Pruitts, and she held baby Elizabeth Whitmore Pruitt, and said something quiet to the Pruitt wife that made the woman press her lips together hard. She went to the barn and assessed the roof repairs, and she found 2 problems with the work that the carpenter had missed, and she told Nathaniel about them with the specificity of a woman who had run her own household on her own for 20 years and knew what she was looking at. On the evening of the 2nd day, she sat across from him at the long dining table he had asked this once for company at dinner, and she had accepted without making a production of it, and she ate her meal and they talked about the estate, the harvest coming, the tenants, the irrigation question in the East Field, which she had apparently discussed with Samuel Pruitt that afternoon, and it was the most natural conversation Nathaniel had had with another person since the morning Elizabeth left, and he understood partway through it that this was intentional on her part, that she was showing him what it looked like a meal where someone was actually present across the table, so that he would remember it afterward and understand what was at stake. Over the coffee, she said, "She's going to the Hendersons' Friday supper again this week. Mrs. Henderson has been very deliberate about making her feel that it is her county, too." "I'm glad," Nathaniel said. "She might," Abigail said carefully, "walk past the South Road on her way there. It is not the most direct route from my house to the Hendersons, but it is a pleasant walk in the evening, and she has mentioned it twice, and I am old enough to know when a woman mentions a thing twice, that she is not mentioning it idly." She looked at him. "The South Road borders Carterland. The fence line runs alongside the Pruitt farm. It is about a 20-minute walk from my gate." Nathaniel looked at his coffee cup. "I am not telling you to be there," Abigail said. "I am telling you that information is not hope, and that you know the difference, and that whatever you decide you will need to have decided it for yourself, and not for the outcome." She rose from the table. "Good night, Mr. Carter. Breakfast at 7 if that's not inconvenient." "7," he said. She left him at the table with the coffee and the long quiet room and a Friday that was 4 days away, and a south road that ran along the fence of the east field where Samuel Pruitt had been teaching him about irrigation, and where on a clear summer evening you could hear the creek from the Pruitt farm and smell the flowering that came in off the fields this time of year, and he sat with it all, and he thought about what Abigail had said. Not information, not hope. Decision for its own sake, for the sake of what was right. He thought about it all the way through Thursday. He did his work. He met with the Pruitt men about the barn. He went over the harvest accounts with Thomas and found 2 more things that Elizabeth's notes had flagged and that he had only just gotten to. And both times he found them, he felt the same thing, a quiet, aching recognition, like hearing a familiar voice from across a field. She was everywhere in this house. She was in the margins of every ledger, and the logic of every arrangement, and the reason the Pruitt's baby had a name that belonged to no unhappy marriage, and she had made herself invisible in all of it, so that he could stand in the middle of everything she had built and feel like it was his. He had not deserved that. He was going to spend a long time not deserving it in the past. But what he did with the future was still a question, and the question had a south road in it, and a woman who had mentioned it twice, and a Friday evening coming on golden and warm. Friday arrived the way important days always arrive. Ordinary in the morning with coffee and accounts, and Thomas asking about the week's provisions, and then suddenly it was late afternoon, and the light had gone, the color. It goes in Virginia in the summer, when the day is tilting toward evening, that long amber that turns everything. It touches into something worth looking at. Nathaniel had not decided that morning what he was going to do. He had made himself not decide, because deciding in the morning meant spending all day performing the decision, and that was not what this was. He walked out of Carter Manor at 6 o'clock. He told no one where he was going. He walked across the yard and down the lane and through the south gate, and he turned onto the south road, and he walked along the fence line where the east field ran alongside him, golden in the evening, and he breathed the air that smelled of everything Elizabeth had grown here and everywhere here had become. He did not walk fast. He was not in a hurry. He had learned these 3 months that hurry was a form of management, and he was done with managing. He had been on the road perhaps 12 minutes when he heard footsteps from the Milford direction, unhurried and steady, and he looked up, and Elizabeth Whitmore was 50 yards away, walking with her head up and her hands easy at her sides, and she saw him at the same moment he saw her, and she stopped. He stopped too. They stood on the south road in the summer evening with 50 yards between them and the east field on one side and the fence on the other, and the sound of the Pruitt Creek somewhere off to the right, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched out long and quiet and completely without pretense. Then she took a breath, and she kept walking toward him. He stayed where he was because moving felt like pressing, and he had promised himself he would not press. He watched her come the same walk she had always had, straight and unhurried, nothing performed in it, just a woman crossing ground she had decided to cross. When she was close enough that he could see her face clearly, she stopped, and they stood with about 10 feet between them, and she looked at him the way she always looked at things all the way at them, without flinching. "You look terrible," she said. "So I've been told," he said. "I'm told it's a good sign." Something moved in her face, the beginning of something that was not quite a smile, but was its near neighbor. "Aunt Abigail," she said. "She's a forthright woman," he said. "She said the same thing about you, in those exact words. I believe it was meant as a compliment." Elizabeth looked at him a moment longer, and he held still under it, and then she said more quietly, "I read your letter, the long one." "I know," he said. You told me things in it that I had been waiting 2 years to hear, she said. And I want you to know that I know what it cost you to write them. I am not going to pretend I don't know because you were honest with me, and I intend to be honest with you, and the truth is that I know it was not easy, and it mattered to me. What you said about my being there, about it being your vision that failed, and not my substance. She stopped. She looked at the fence line briefly, then back at him. No one had ever said that to me before. In those words. About anything. They should have, he said. Yes, she agreed. They should have. A long time ago. She shifted her weight slightly. I am still not ready, Nathaniel. I want to be honest with you about that the way I've tried to be honest throughout these letters. I am not going to stand on this road and tell you I'm ready to come home because you wrote me a beautiful letter and did the right thing in Fredericksburg and learned the irrigation ditch. That is not who I am, and it is not what this deserves. I know, he said. But she said, and the words sat there between them for a moment before she continued. I am less unready than I was, and I am standing on this road which I did not have to do, and I am talking to you which I am choosing to do, and I think you understand what those things mean without me having to explain them. I do, he said. She looked at him steadily. Tell me one true thing, she said. Not a managed thing, not a thing you've worked out. Tell me something true that you haven't said yet. He didn't hesitate. I am afraid, he said, that I know what to do now and that I will find a way to fail you again anyway, because the habits of a man who never learned to look run very deep, and I do not fully trust myself yet, and I think you deserve to know that I don't. I'm not telling you that so you'll reassure me. I'm telling you because you asked for something unmanaged, and that is the most unmanaged thing I have. Elizabeth was quiet. Then she said, That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me in 5 years of knowing each other. I'm aware. It's a start, she said. And she reached out and she touched his arm just briefly, just once her hand on his sleeve, and then gone the lightest possible contact, and she said, I'm going to the Hendersons. I'll be late if I stand here much longer. I know, he said. Go. She walked past him down the south road, and he turned and watched her go, and at the bend, she looked back once, not the way Caroline had looked back, not with calculation, but simply the way a person looks back at something they are not yet done thinking about, and then she turned the bend and was gone. Nathaniel Carter stood on the south road in the summer evening for a long time. She had touched his arm. She had told him it was a start. She had walked down a road she didn't have to walk down, and she had chosen to keep walking, and he stood in the warm amber light of a Virginia July evening and felt spreading through him slowly, carefully, like something that has been frozen and is very slowly beginning to thaw. The thing he had not let himself feel in 3 months. The thing that was larger than hope and more honest and considerably more frightening. He was not ready either. That was the truth. He hadn't said yet, the one that came to him standing alone on the road with the sound of her footsteps still in his ears. Not ready, but moving. Not certain, but willing. Not the man he used to be, and not yet the man she deserved, and somewhere in the space between those two things, finally beginning to become someone worth standing beside. He turned and walked home through the golden evening, and Carter Manor rose up at the end of the road the way it always had, and for the first time in 3 months it looked to the man walking toward it, not like an indictment, but like a question. A question he had perhaps just barely begun to earn the right to answer. He did not write to her the day after the South Road. He had learned these months that the impulse to reach immediately after a moment of connection was its own kind of management, the need to pin it down to secure what had been offered before it could be taken back. Elizabeth had touched his arm and told him it was a start, and walked to the Henderson supper, and the right thing to do with that was to let it be what it was without adding weight to it. So he went back to his fields, and he went back to his accounts, and he went back to the steady, unremarkable work of becoming someone worth standing beside, and he let the South Road be the South Road and nothing more. What he did not expect was that she would write first. The letter arrived Monday morning, 2 days after the South Road, and it was not long, and the handwriting was the unhurried kind she used when she had thought about what she wanted to say before she sat down to say it. Nathaniel. I have been thinking about what you said, that you do not fully trust yourself yet. I have been turning it over for 2 days, and I want to tell you what I think of it, because you were honest with me, and I owe you honesty back. I think it is the first thing you have ever said to me that made me feel safe. Not because weakness makes me feel safe, but because a man who knows his own limitations and names them out loud is a man who is not going to be ambushed by them in the dark and take me down with him. You were ambushed before. By fear. By habit. By a woman who understood your fear and used it. You couldn't see it coming because you didn't know what you were carrying. You know now. That is not a small thing. I am not saying it cancels anything. I am saying it matters. E.W. He read it standing at his desk, and he stood there for a full minute after just breathing. Then he sat down, and he wrote back, and the letter was short because some things are shorter when they're true. Elizabeth, thank you. I will not say more than that, because more would be management, and I am done with management. Except this, you said I made you feel safe. I have thought about what that means for a man who spent 33 years making absolutely certain no one could touch him, and what it means is that I have a great deal further to go, and I intend to go it. N.C. She wrote back Wednesday. The cabbages are finished. Aunt Abigail says the garden will miss me if I leave. I told her the garden will survive. She said that was not the point. He sat with that letter for a long time. Then he wrote, "Is it the point?" She did not answer that letter. Not in writing. What she did instead arrived in the form of Abigail Monroe's voice, which came through his front door on Thursday afternoon, attached to Abigail Monroe herself, who appeared without advance notice for the second time, except this time she did not come alone. He heard the carriage in the yard, and then he heard Thomas's voice elevated with the particular quality it got when something unexpected was occurring, and then he heard a second voice in the hall, lower than Abigail's, quieter, and so familiar after 4 months of letters that he recognized it before he had fully registered what he was hearing, and he was out of his study and in the hallway in 3 strides, and Elizabeth was standing in Carter Manor for the first time since July, with a traveling bag at her feet, and her aunt at her shoulder, and her face doing the careful, composed thing it did when she was feeling more than she intended to show. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm not back," she said immediately and clearly, because she had apparently anticipated that he might misread the bag. "I want to say that plainly, so we are not having a misunderstanding in the first 30 seconds. I am not back. I am visiting. I wanted to see the East Field before the harvest. And Thomas wrote to me last week that the Pruitt barn roof was finished, and I wanted to see it because I was the one who noticed it needed repair in the first place, and I did not get to see it done." She paused. "That is why I came." "All right," Nathaniel said. She looked at him a moment longer as though she had prepared for more resistance. "That's all you're going to say?" "You told me why you came," he said. "I believe you. The barn roof looks well. I think you'll approve of the work." Something in her face loosened slightly. Abigail behind her made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been the natural consequence of being 70 years old and standing in a hallway with a traveling bag. Thomas appeared and relieved both women of their bags with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this particular arrival for 4 months and was not going to fumble it. "I'll have the East Room made up," Thomas said to Elizabeth, and not to Nathaniel, which was exactly the right instinct. "And tea, I think, if that suits." "That suits perfectly," Elizabeth said. "Thank you, Thomas." The old man went, and there was a moment in the hallway, the 3 of them, Nathaniel and Elizabeth and Abigail, and then Abigail said, "I believe I would like to sit down," and walked past both of them toward the sitting room with the authority of a woman who had assessed the house 4 weeks ago and knew where everything was. That left Nathaniel and Elizabeth alone in the hallway with the traveling bag Thomas had taken, and the afternoon light coming in through the front window, and 4 months of letters between them and the South Road, and everything before the South Road. And Elizabeth looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was not uncomfortable, but was very full. "I thought about what you asked," she said finally. "Whether it was the point." "I know," he said. "It is," she said. The garden surviving was not the point. She held his gaze. "I want to see the east field." "I'll walk out with you," he said, "if you'll have the company." She considered it for exactly one beat. "Yes," she said. "All right." They walked out through the back of the house and across the yard, and Samuel Pruitt saw them from the fence line of his property and took off his hat, and Elizabeth raised a hand to him, and Samuel Pruitt put his hat back on and turned back to his work, with a precision that suggested he was very deliberately not watching, which Nathaniel appreciated more than he could say. The east field was at the tail end of summer, the crop coming in full and gold, and Elizabeth walked along the edge of it the way she always had, with her hands behind her back, and her eyes moving over everything, taking account, reading the land the way she had always been able to read it. Nathaniel walked beside her, and did not speak, because she was doing something that did not require his words. After a while she said, "The ditch." "Samuel showed me," Nathaniel said. "It's diverting correctly now. The south section was the problem." "I know. I wrote it in the field book." She glanced at him sideways. "Did you find the field book?" "Thomas gave it to me," he said. "In September. I've been using it." "I saw," she said, and at his look, "I asked Thomas. He said you'd been adding to it." She paused. "Your handwriting is better than I expected." "You expected bad handwriting. You always sign documents like a man in a hurry," she said. "I thought it would carry over." "I'm not in as much of a hurry as I used to be," he said. And she looked at him when he said it, and something passed between them that was too honest and too new to name, and they both let it pass without trying. They reached the Pruitt barn, and Elizabeth stopped, and she looked at the repaired roof with the frank satisfaction of someone seeing a completed thing they had started, and she said, "Good, it was going to lose half the winter's grain if it wasn't sorted." She ran her hand along the new timber at the eave. "Who did the work?" "A man from Milford named Carver. He came recommended by the Pruitts." "He does good work," Elizabeth said. "I'll remember that." And then she heard herself, and a slight color came into her face, and Nathaniel very carefully did not remark on either the words or the color. They walked back as the light began to go amber, and it was the walk Nathaniel had thought about on the south road, the east field in the evening, which Elizabeth had told her aunt she missed, and it was exactly as she had described it, warm and golden, and smelling of everything the summer had made of this land. And he thought about her lying at this place in her letters to Abigail while she was still living here, filing it away in her mind, the way you file away a thing you love, because some part of you already knows you're going to lose it. And the thought went through him sharp and clean and aching. "I missed it," she said quietly, as if she'd heard him thinking. "I told Aunt Abigail I missed it, and she said it wasn't strange. She was right. It's not strange." She stopped walking. She turned to face him, and the evening light was on her face, and she looked at him with the directness she had always had, the looking all the way at the thing. And she said, "I need to ask you something that I have been not asking for 4 months because I wasn't ready to hear the answer. I think I'm ready now." "Ask it," he said. "If I came back," she said, "not the way it was. I will not come back to what was. I meant that when I said it, and I still mean it. But if I came back to something new, something we built honestly from the beginning, with none of the silences and none of the management and none of the pretending, would you know how to do that? Not could you try, not would you want to. Would you know how?" He was quiet for a moment. He did not reach for an answer before he had it. "No," he said. "I would not know how. I don't think either of us would. I think it is the kind of thing that has to be learned while you're doing it. And I think we would make mistakes, and I think there would be days where I fall back into old habits without knowing I've done it. And I think you would need to be able to tell me when that happens, and I would need to be able to hear it without retreating." He held her gaze. "What I can tell you is that I am more prepared to learn it now than I have ever been prepared to learn anything in my life, and that I know what it costs when I don't. And that I will never again mistake your silence for contentment, because I know now that you go quiet when you have given up on being heard, and I am not going to give you reason to go quiet again." Elizabeth held his gaze for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the right answer." "Is it enough?" he asked. She breathed in slowly. "I don't know yet," she said. "But it's the right answer, and I know the difference." They went inside and dinner was in the dining room, and this time there were 4 people at the table, Nathaniel and Thomas and Abigail and Elizabeth, and the room sounded completely different than it had for 4 months. It sounded like a room that was being used for what it was meant for. It sounded like people at a table who had things to say to each other and were saying them, and the conversation moved from the barn roof to the harvest accounts, to Abigail's garden, to a land dispute in the next county that Elizabeth had read about in a newspaper. And at some point Nathaniel said something about Samuel Pruitt's irrigation theory, and Elizabeth disagreed with him directly and immediately, and without softening it, and said why she disagreed, and he listened, and he said she was probably right, and she said she was definitely right. And Thomas made a sound that was quickly converted into a cough, and Abigail drank her wine with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for that particular exchange. After dinner, Abigail retired early with the lack of ceremony of a woman who has accomplished what she came to accomplish and sees no reason to linger over it. Thomas went to close up the house, and Nathaniel and Elizabeth were left in the sitting room with the last of the evening, and Elizabeth was in the chair she had always used. He had not known it was her chair. Thomas had told him, pointing it out one evening in the fall as the particular chair by the east window that she had always preferred. And she had a book in her lap, though she was not reading it, and he was across from her, and neither of them was performing anything at all. "I'm going to stay a few days," Elizabeth said, not looking up from the not reading. "Aunt Abigail says she wants to see the orchard. I think she actually just wants to see the Pruitts' baby again. The baby appears to have made a significant impression." "She's a fine baby," Nathaniel said. "I held her when I was in Milford," Elizabeth said. "She's got a grip like a small landlord." A pause. "She looked at me like she knew me." "Maybe she does," Nathaniel said. "Babies might know more than we think." Elizabeth looked up from the book, and she was almost smiling, and he had been right about the smile. He did remember the sound of her laugh. He had found the memory sometime in October late at night. Unexpectedly, the particular quality of it and the way it changed her whole face. And the almost smile was the edge of that. The approach of it, and he felt it the way you feel the warmth of a fire before you're close enough to see the flame. "You're different," she said. "From the man who put the papers on the table. You know that." "I know," he said. "I don't mean better dressed," she said. "I mean something in you is quieter. You used to fill a room in a way that made it hard to breathe, even when you weren't doing anything. Just the way you held yourself, like you were waiting to defend something." She studied him. "You're not doing that now." "I haven't had as much to defend," he said. "When you take away the armor, you're considerably smaller. I'm getting used to it." "Smaller isn't the right word," she said. "What's the right word?" She thought about it. "Present," she said. "You're present in a way you weren't before, like you've actually arrived somewhere instead of patrolling it." He sat with that. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about it," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 4 months," she said. "I've had time." She set the book aside and looked at him steadily. "Nathaniel, I need to tell you something, and it is going to sound like I am giving you more than I am ready to give, so I need you to hear it at exactly the weight I mean it, and not more." "All right," he said, and he meant it. "I do not want to leave," she said. "I don't mean tonight. I mean I came here telling myself I was coming to see the barn roof and the east field, and those things are true, but they are not the whole truth, and you asked me for whole truths. So here it is. I came because I wanted to be here. I wanted to walk the east field and sit in this chair and hear this house at dinner and know that the people on this land are well. I came because this place," her voice held very steady, "this place is mine in a way that 4 months in Aunt Abigail's garden did not change. I built something here. I put my hands into it. And walking away from it was the right thing to do, and I would do it again. And it also cost me more than I let anyone see, including you. Especially you." "I know," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady either. "I found all of it. Everything you built. I know exactly what it cost you to leave it." "Then you understand," she said, "when I tell you that I do not want to leave again. Not because I'm afraid of the alternative, but because this is where my work is, and my people, and the East Field in the evening, and—" She stopped. She looked at him very directly. "And you. You are part of what is here. You have been part of it even these 4 months, through every letter, and I am done pretending otherwise to protect myself from hoping too much." The room was very quiet. "Elizabeth," he said. "Don't manage it," she said. "Don't give me a speech. Just tell me the truth." "The truth," he said, "is that every morning for 4 months I have woken up in this house, and the first thing I have thought about is you. Not what to say to you, not how to get you back. Just you. The way you put the pen down, the way you touched my arm on the South Road, the way you write the number 7 in the field book because it looks exactly like you're arguing with it." He stopped, started again. "I love you. I loved you badly and wrong, and without looking at you for 2 years, and I am not asking you to count that as anything except what it was, which was a failure. But I love you now in a way that is not about what you do for this house, or this land, or this name. I love you because you told Caroline Whitaker to her face exactly what she had done in the room where it happened with witnesses, and you were right, and you knew you were right, and you said it without raising your voice. I love you because you named a baby Elizabeth and asked for it to be kept quiet. I love you because you wrote to me all autumn, and you never once let me off easy, and you never once were cruel. I love you because you came today to see a barn roof." He held her gaze. "That is the truth. All of it. Do with it what you need to." Elizabeth Whitmore sat very still in the chair by the east window for a moment that was long enough to matter and short enough to bear. Then she said, "I'm going to need things to be different. Specifically different, not just in intention. I need to be consulted about the estate decisions, not informed after, consulted before. I need to be able to disagree with you in front of the household without it being an incident. I need you to come to me when something is troubling you, instead of going cold and closed and making me guess. And I need—" She paused, and this one cost her something. "I need you to ask me things that matter. Not about the accounts, about me. What I fear, what I hope for, what I need. I needed that from the beginning, and I never asked for it because I thought I could make myself need less, and I cannot and I will not pretend I can anymore." "Yes," he said, "to all of it, without qualification." "You say that now." "I will say it in 6 months," he said. "I will say it when I've failed at one of them, which I will, and you tell me which you will. And I have to hear it and do better rather than defending myself. I know that is the test. I'm not asking you to trust me before the test. I'm asking for the chance to take it." She breathed out slowly. Something in her shoulders released something she had been holding since she walked through the door, maybe since July, maybe longer than that. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said again with the finality of a woman who has made a decision. "I'll stay. Not as I was. Not as a wife who manages quietly and hopes to be seen. As a partner, equal footing in everything. If you fail at it, I'll tell you. If I fail at it, and I will because I have my own habits to break, and pretending I don't is dishonest, you tell me. We build it in the open, or we don't build it at all." "In the open," he said. "Every brick." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she stood up from her chair and she crossed the room and she held out her hand. Not for a handshake, just held it out open, offered the way you offer something you are choosing to give. He took it, and her hand was warm, and she did not pull away, and they stood there in the sitting room of Carter Manor in the last of the evening light, holding on two people who had failed each other and said so out loud, and come back to the same house, and decided with full knowledge of all the ways they could go wrong to try again. Not the marriage they'd had. Something new. Something built on ground they'd both cleared with their own hands. The next morning, Elizabeth was at the estate desk by 7, with the field book open and the harvest accounts beside her and a cup of coffee at her elbow. And when Nathaniel came in, she looked up and said, "The North Granary allocation is wrong. Whoever figured this projected a full yield, but the east corner bins were only 3/4 last month. We're going to come up short in February if we don't adjust. He sat down across from her. What do we need to do? She turned the book to face him and pointed and explained, and he listened without interrupting, and without the old instinct to establish that he already understood. He simply listened all the way through, the way he should have been listening from the beginning. When she was done, he said, "What do you suggest?" "Shift 20% to contract with the Miller firm before December," she said. "They'll give us the old rate if we approach them before harvest is complete countywide. After that, we're competing." "Do you know someone at the Miller firm?" "I know his wife," she said. "Which is more useful?" "Then you should make the approach," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth looked at him, not with surprise, not quite, but with something that was its first cousin, the look of a person registering that a thing they expected to have to argue for has simply been offered. "Yes," she said, "I will." And she wrote it in the field book in her small, precise hand, and he watched her write it, and he felt something settle in him, the way heavy things settle when they are finally put down in the right place. Thomas appeared in the doorway and looked at both of them at the desk, and his face did the thing it had been doing since the night before, the thing it did when 50 years of service to a complicated family, finally after everything arrived at a morning that resembled what it ought to have been from the start. "Breakfast," Thomas said with a dignity that barely contained everything underneath it. "In a moment," Elizabeth said, not looking up. "Take your time," Thomas said, and went. Samuel Pruitt came up to the house at 9, the way he had taken to doing since Nathaniel had started going to the field, and he stopped short in the doorway of the estate office when he saw Elizabeth at the desk. And he took his hat off, and he said, "Miss Elizabeth," in a voice that had a whole autumn's worth of hoping in it. "Samuel," Elizabeth said. "Sit down. Tell me about the drainage in the south section. Mr. Carter says you've been working on it." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, sitting, turning his hat in his hands, his face doing something complicated and glad. "It's coming along, though if I'm honest, the whole thing was your design from the start. He's just been following the plan you laid out." Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel met her eyes and said, "That's accurate." She said. And there it was, the smile full and real, the one he had found the memory of in October. The one he had been waiting to see again since July. And she turned back to Samuel and said, "Then let's talk about whether the plan needs adjusting now that we're into fall." And the morning went on around them, practical and warm, and full of the ordinary texture of a household, where two people were actually genuinely paying attention. The day brought its ordinary demands. After that, the Pruitt's barn documentation, to finalize a letter from the Miller firm, to draft a question from Cook about the autumn preserves that Elizabeth answered with the efficiency of a woman who had been thinking about the autumn preserves since she left, and had opinions ready and in the middle of it all. Late in the afternoon, Nathaniel found Elizabeth standing at the door of the sitting room looking in, and he came to stand beside her, and she said without preamble, "I want to move the desk to the east window. I always thought it would get better light there, and I never moved it because I thought—" She stopped. "Because I thought I shouldn't change things without asking." "Move it," he said. "Just like that. It's your house," he said. "Move the desk." She looked at him. "It's our house," she said. "That's the point." "Our house," he said. "Move the desk." She moved the desk. Thomas helped, and it took 10 minutes and considerable rearranging, and when it was done, Elizabeth stood back and looked at it in the east light and said, "Yes, that's right. That's where it should have been." And she sat down at it in the chair she had always used by the east window, and she opened the field book, and the afternoon light came across her hands and her handwriting. And Nathaniel stood in the doorway of his own sitting room and watched her, and thought that this exact thing, a woman at a desk in good light doing the work she was born to do, in the house that was hers, was what he had walked past for 2 years without seeing. And he was seeing it now, and he intended to keep seeing it for the rest of his life. Abigail Monroe found him standing there and stood beside him, and they both looked at Elizabeth at the desk, and after a moment, Abigail said quietly, "She moved the desk." I told her to, Nathaniel said. She told me once. Abigail said, equally quiet, that she never moved it because she wasn't certain enough of her place to rearrange the furniture. She said she felt like a guest in her own home. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. It landed where it was supposed to land, and he held it there, not flinching from it. She doesn't look like a guest now, Abigail said. No, Nathaniel said. She doesn't. Abigail looked at him sideways. You'll make mistakes, she said. I want to say it plainly before I leave so you have no excuse for forgetting. You will fall back on old habits. You will close up when you should open. You will manage when you should listen. And when you do... She stopped him before he could speak. When you do not because you are 33 years old and 33 years of a certain kind of living does not dissolve in 4 months of letters. When you do, you will not hide from it. You will tell her. You will say the words out loud. I did the thing I said I wouldn't do. And then you will do better. That is the whole of it. Do you understand? Yes, he said. Good, she said, and patted his arm. Once the same brief contact Elizabeth had given him on the South Road, and then she walked away down the hall and left him standing in the doorway. Abigail Monroe left the next morning early, with the efficiency of a woman who had done what she came to do. She embraced Elizabeth in the front hall, and Elizabeth held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and Abigail said something against her hair that Nathaniel was not close enough to hear. And Elizabeth nodded, and then the carriage was gone, and the yard was quiet. Elizabeth stood in the yard for a moment after the carriage turned the road. Then she squared her shoulders the way she had always done that particular gathering of herself. That decision to go forward, and she turned back to the house, and she came up the steps past Nathaniel, and she said, The Miller letter needs to go out today if we're going to catch them before the harvest weekend. I'll have Thomas send a man, Nathaniel said. I'll write it, she said. I know how to ask Mrs. Miller's husband for a favor, which is a different skill than simply asking him. Write it, he said. I trust your judgment. She paused at the door, turned back to look at him still on the step below her, which put them eye to eye for once, and she looked at him with the directness she'd always had, the looking all the way through, and she said, You're going to have to keep saying that, not because I need to hear it constantly, but because I spent 2 years in a house where I didn't hear it at all, and the habit of not hearing it is going to take time to unlearn. I know, he said. I'll keep saying it. Good, she said, and went inside. He followed her in. The door closed behind them both, and Carter Manor settled around them, warm and full and alive, in the way it had been alive these past months, only in pieces. The people on the land, the work in the fields, the sound of Thomas moving through the house. And now it was alive, all the way through the way a thing is alive when every part of it is doing what it was made for. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth signed the Miller contract at the east window desk in the afternoon light that was exactly right for it, and she signed it as Elizabeth Carter, not tentatively, not with the quiet grief of a woman signing away her marriage, but with the full confident stroke of a woman signing her own name onto her own work. Nathaniel sat across from her and watched her sign it, and he did not tell her where to sign. He did not tell her anything. He simply waited until she looked up, and when she did, he said, Are you ready? Elizabeth Whitmore? Carter looked at her signature on the page, and at the east field, going gold through the window, and at the man across the desk, who was watching her with the full and unhurried attention of someone who had learned finally how to look. For the first time, she said, Yes. And the woman who had once signed her name to the end of a marriage now signed it to the beginning of something true, something chosen, something built, something that belonged to both of them equally, and would be tended that way from this day forward, in the clear, honest light of a Virginia morning, with nothing hidden, and nothing pretended, and nothing wasted anymore. That was how a great love finally begins, not with a ring placed on a finger in a church full of witnesses, but with two people who have seen each other at their worst and still turned back toward each other and chosen with open eyes and full knowledge of the cost to stay.